This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Ratio Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy. Alright, hey guys, so this is going to be a webinar for the 7th meeting for Ratio Christi. Today we have Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, who is an esteemed professor at, I believe now, the London School of Theology.
Yeah, so I've actually moved. So I'm a teaching fellow now at University of Birmingham. So
Gotcha.
That's interesting. Yeah, so working in philosophy there, which is good.
Gotcha, cool. But yeah, he's going to be presenting on his Exemplarist Theodicy when it comes to the problem of evil. So without further ado, take it away, Doc.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Let me, just to clarify, yeah, so can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to be speaking about today with you is the Exemplarist Theodicy. So I'm going to be sort of navigating through the problem of evil, which is a very big problem. As people know in philosophy of religion, it's probably the central problem that a theist would face when they are putting forward arguments for God's existence or arguing for the rationality of belief in the existence of God. And so I'm going to put forward a new theodicy. It's a theodicy which I would say is new in that it has various elements which haven't been found in the literature. However, it does draw from other, I would say, greater good theodicy. So I'm going to define my terms a bit later, but it does sort of have a history of defense within the philosophy of religion literature, but it is sort of new in the way that it's sort of bringing everything together. And I do believe it does provide a successful theodicy. And so hopefully people enjoy it, and hopefully it'll provide them with sort of reasons to sort of believe in God in light of the problem of evil. Okay, so just moving on now. So what I'm going to focus on firstly is the nature of suffering, because what I'm going to be specifically tackling in this presentation, and just for people to know, this is sort of a very summarized version of what people will find in a forthcoming book of mine with Routledge, which hopefully will be coming out next year, which again is going to be titled the same thing, The Problem of Evil and the Exemplarist Theodicy. So I'm only going to be able to give a piecemeal version of that, but hopefully it'll be enough for people to understand what the theodicy is, and hopefully whet their appetite as well for wanting to go forward and read the monograph when it's out. So specifically my work, I focus in on the problem of suffering. Now, the problem of suffering is a more focused issue than the general problem of evil, because evil can just be defined very broadly as the existence of a bad state. So evil is just a bad state of affairs. So something which an individual goes through, and it's a bad state of affairs, something which has negative value as a state of affairs. And that's just what evil is. However, evil itself doesn't really, I would say, on a daily basis, provide a real problem for people, because there's many bad states of affairs which don't bring up questions for why we believe in God. But the one that really does bring up questions is the existence of suffering, which is a form of evil. It is a bad state of affairs, but it's a specific one which sort of calls into question for a lot of people the existence of God. So I would say it's the harder problem of the problem of evil, and that's why I really want to tackle it. But before we sort of look at the theodicy, so the explanation for why God allows suffering, specifically then evil, is that we will need to focus and define our terms first, which is what is suffering, because a lot of people assume that they have an understanding of suffering, but actually when it comes down to it, what is suffering, a lot of people do struggle to define what actually means for an individual to experience a suffering circumstance in their life. And so what will be good at this moment now is to define what we mean by the word suffering. So suffering is an unpleasant experience comprising both a sensation and a desire for that sensation to cease, capturing physical, mental, and, in humans, social dimensions. So what I'm drawing from is something called the Desire account of suffering, which was defended by a person called Michael Brady in a very influential work called Suffering and Virtue. And he's not a theist, so this isn't a definition of suffering that fits with a theistic framework. It's just a general idea of suffering that he believed was very important, that there are two necessary elements for an experience to be counted as a suffering experience. And so just sort of fleshing this out a little bit more precisely, the subject suffers when and only when she has, firstly, an unpleasant experience consisting of a sensation S and the desire S not be occurring. And secondly, and a current desire that this unpleasant experience not be occurring. So suffering experience is something which includes a sensation, that is a pain or distress that someone wants to cease occurring. So it's a sensation that someone's feeling. It could be a mental sensation, a physical sensation, and there's also a desire for this sensation to stop. Because merely having a sensation without the desire for its cessation is not sufficient to constitute suffering. Because many people might feel a pain, but they actually might not want that pain to stop. Many people might have mental fatigue, but whatever they're doing that's causing the mental fatigue, they actually don't want that thing to stop. And so the idea here is that suffering is only something which can be realized when there is that sensation, but there's also desire, a current desire that's occurring at that time for that sensation to also stop. And so given this, then there are different ways in which we can cash this out along different dimensions. Physical dimensions, so there's bodily pain, injury, illness, hunger, exhaustion. So any of these things which are aversive sensory experiences and that also register negatively in the consciousness, that creates a desire for relief. That is something which can be caused by a sensation, and there's a desire, and then we can call that then a suffering experience. So if I'm feeling pain in my leg and I want that pain to stop, that will be a suffering experience. But then also you have emotional and mental dimensions. So someone could have anxiety, someone could have fear, grief, loneliness, despair, anguish. And there might not be a physical pain that the person's feeling, but there is still a sensation, a mental sensation that the person is experiencing, the fear or loneliness that they're going through. And because this, again, has a negative effect and there's a desire for that sensation to stop, that would, again, be a suffering experience. We also have social dimensions of suffering. You can have exploitation, oppression, injustice within communities. So this can happen again, specifically for humans, where there is something that they're undergoing at a social level, but there is also a desire for this to stop. So injustice that's occurring socially, that could be a suffering experience corporately for people, and it's something which is a suffering experience because they want it to stop, and it's something that they're negatively valenced experience that they're going through. And so what we can say then is suffering really is a fundamental feature of reality, such that it's universal. It's something which is not just pocketed in one area of the world or one time of the history of the world. So it's geographically and also culturally and temporally located in that it's all over the place. Okay, so geographically. It's also culturally, it's in different cultures that people experience suffering. And also it's temporally, that means at different times, different generations, people have gone through suffering upon suffering upon suffering. So it's a universal and fundamental feature of reality. And so this is something that someone who is not a theist will say, well, how can we account for this? Because if people put forward such things as, like, let's say, the cosmological features of reality, or they put forward the teleological or the moral features, and they say God is the best explanation for this, then we also need to say as theists, well, what's the best explanation for why there is suffering here? And it seems to be for a lot of non-theists, they would say that suffering provides reasons to actually not believe in God. And so what we can then say is that theists has it upon themselves that they need to construct something called a theodicy. So the question is, well, what is a theodicy? A theodicy is something which provides a possible, morally sufficient reason for why God allows suffering. So a theodicy at a more specific level is when we are trying to provide a justification for why there is a suffering experience. So why does God allow this individual? It could be a human, it could be a non-human animal. And we have to give a reason for why God allows this individual to go through this suffering experience. Because the idea here is that God has the ability to stop this experience from occurring. He also has the knowledge of how to do that. And he also would have motivation to do it, given that he's omnibenevolent or perfectly good. He wouldn't want this negative experience that the person wants to stop to keep on going on. And so the idea here is that it seems to present a problem logically, but also evidentially for there being a God. Now, a theodicy is something which needs to be distinguished from a defense. So in the philosophy of religion literature, as your audience will know, Alvin Plantinga, who's a very influential philosopher of religion in the 1970s, he put forward the free will defense, which was an idea that he put forward to deal with a problem raised by J.L. Mackie. And he put forward this idea of a defense for God's existence in light of the problem of evil. And a defense is something which just gives a possible reason that shows a logical compatibility with God and evil. And so the idea here is that you're trying to show, well, this could be the case that God allowed this suffering to happen because of this thing that he wanted to bring about. And it doesn't have to be grounded in any form of reality. So, for example, Plantinga uses sort of the ideas of demons and evil spirits as a way to account for natural evil. Now, for a lot of people, especially non-theists, they would not have those types of entities within their worldview. So they would not see that as a plausible explanation for why God will allow evil. But something with a defense is you're just putting forward something to say, well, actually, this is just a possible scenario that could be actualized. And so that deals with the problem. So Plantinga was successful in dealing with Mackie's problem because he just needed to provide a reason to show that there is no logical incompatibility, even though that the reasons might not be grounded in reality. But theodicy goes a little bit further in that it does puts forward a possible reason. So we're not actually saying that this is definitely the reason in which why God allows suffering. But what we are saying is that we have good reasons to believe that this is a probable reason that God will use, or a plausible one. So it seems to be grounded upon reality. So the theodicy that I'm going to put forward is something that I do believe is defensible along many dimensions, and we have good reasons to believe the things that I'm going to be arguing for. And so theodicy goes further to say, we're not just putting forward statements which are logically compatible or show the logical compatibility with God and evil, but we're also going to put forward a morally sufficient reason, which seems to be grounded upon things that we have or we take to be part of reality. And so that's what I'm going to be putting forward. So it's a harder task for the person who's putting forward a theodicy than a defense. But I think in sort of the cultural climate that we're in, where people are really seeking for morally sufficient reasons for why God allows suffering, that we need to take on that tougher task of providing a theodicy. So my goal would be to reconcile the observed reality of suffering with belief in a benevolent and powerful divine being. So basically answering the question, why does God allow this to occur? But what also a successful theodicy must do, which a lot of over time in the literature hasn't done, is provide a morally sufficient reason for why God allows both human and animal suffering. Because a lot of the dialectic, the conversation on evil has changed a lot from conversations of why does God allow humans to suffer to why does God allow humans and animals to suffer. And that's a lot harder to account for, given sort of the existing solutions that are being put forward, the existing defenses and theodicies. So that's a tough task to put forward. Why does God allow moral evil, human wrongdoing? Why does he allow natural evil, which will also include that of animal suffering? So you've got the big task of accounting for a lot of things with a good theodicy. Now, the type of theodicy that I'm going to put forward falls into the tradition of greater good theodicies. Now, this is one of the dominant approaches in philosophy of religion, that a lot of people try to justify suffering by reference to goods that require or outweigh it. So that means that evil is brought about to bring about a further good that could not be had without the evil experience occurring or the suffering experience. And so greater good theodicies, I would say, are probably the dominant way in which people are trying to deal with the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And so that's the sort of tradition I'm going from. I'm going within the greater good theodicy. Now, just to sort of define this a little bit further. So the idea here is that God allows humans and animals to suffer for the sake of a greater good. That is a good state of affairs that cannot be achieved without allowing that suffering, or at least not in a morally permissible way for God. So maybe it could be achieved by someone bringing about the suffering, but it would not be allowed for a being like God. So maybe I could bring it about because I'm not perfectly good. I could bring about the good without the evil occurring. But I would not be able to do it if I was God, because God is constrained by his perfect goodness. Like, he will only do what is perfectly good. And so he cannot bring about the good in ways which are morally wrong. He can only bring about the good in good ways. And so that means that it might require that he can only bring about the good with also an evil occurring. And so what we can see then is that there are two necessary conditions for greater good. A state of affairs is a greater good if and only if allowing an individual to suffer is the only morally permissible way in which God can make possible the occurrence of a good state of affairs. So we can call this the necessity condition. And secondly, the expected value of allowing the experience of suffering, given the good state of affairs, must be positive. This is the value condition. The good must outweigh the suffering. So we have two things here. The good is necessitated by the suffering, and the good must outweigh, the value of the good must outweigh the value or the disvalue of the suffering. So something that's very prominent in the literature are various theodicies that fall into this category of greater goods, and they sort of put forward these two ideas of what makes a greater good. Swinburne is the main one who sort of argued in this way, and so even though I'm a big proponent of Swinburne's work, I will call myself a Swinburnian, but I do not actually adopt his theodicy, but I do adopt his conceptualization of what it means for a greater good to be a greater good. And so that is these two ideas that he himself was arguing for, that you have to have a necessity condition. The good has to be necessitated by the evil or the suffering, and the expected value has to outweigh that of the expected value of the evil. And then you also have other people. So you have Eleanor Stump, Trent Doherty. These are individuals as well who have sort of argued for, in their own theodicies, for these two conditions holding. And so what happens a lot of the time, though, with the greater good theodicies is that there are some limitations, because often they struggle to explain things like distribution and severity of suffering. Sometimes they risk valuing abstract goods over concrete reality of individual suffering. They also face difficulties with animal pain that serves no apparent purpose for the animal itself. So greater good theodicies, as I was saying, are the dominant approach, but it's also an approach in which there are some challenges that have been put forward. So in my sort of theodicy, I need to meet these challenges if I'm going to have a successful greater good theodicy. Okay, so the idea here is just to sort of break this down a little bit more, because I think it's good that people have this in mind about the nature of a greater good, because that's going to really play a big role. Because unfortunately, what happens a lot of the time with the problem of evil is that because it's such a challenging and real issue, like compared to any other issue that we have to face, suffering is something that people might experience on a daily basis in their life. And so that question of, if there is a God, why does he allow my grandmother to suffer, my child to suffer, my dog to suffer, me to suffer, people in other countries who are suffering in war, why are they going through this, or poverty? So there's so many things that we hear on a daily basis or we experience ourselves that indicate suffering is a reality. And so what happens a lot of the time is that people are not taking their emotions away from the analysis. But when we are doing work as philosophers, and philosophy of religion is an area of philosophy, and so we need to do theoretical work here. And the challenge for someone who says evil and suffering are incompatible with God, that could be logically or evidentially, they need to show why this is the case. And so the person who defends the existence of God in light of suffering, the person who puts forward a theodicy, what they need to do is try and show where these two conditions are met. If that can be shown, then they have a successful theodicy. Because if they're putting forward this idea that God allows evil to occur because it brings about a greater good, then if they can show the necessity condition and the value condition of held, then they have a successful explanation for why God allows evil. And so that dissolves any charge of incompatibility. So that's why then we really need to understand this properly. So for suffering to be justified, specific conditions regarding necessity and value must be met. So the good must be achievable only through allowing the suffering in question. So that means there needs to be a very strong claim of necessity here. The suffering must either be logically necessary, sorry. That means it cannot be achieved even by a being who's omnipotent without it. So even though God is omnipotent, he could not bring about logically the good without the suffering occurring. Or it's the only morally permissible means by which God can bring about the good. And so there is a very strong claim in the necessity condition that you only have this as a successful explanation for why God allows evil if this good that you are trying to claim is a greater good has necessitation from the suffering experience. If the necessity link doesn't hold, then you do not have a greater good there. And so it's not just about convenient. So it's not just that God will allow it, but he could have brought about it another means or another way. It's that this was the only way in which God could have allowed this to occur. And so there's a constraint here when it comes to omnipotence, as I've already said. Because God is a being who can only do what's logically possible, the idea here is that God can only bring about this greater good, which he'll want to do if he's a perfectly good being, but he can only bring about it logically if there is this suffering occurring. So if we say, yes, this greater good should come about, but then we have to have it with the evil, then you have to have the evil coming along with it. And because you believe that God would want to bring about this greater good, then you have to also stomach in a way the idea that there is going to be this suffering experience that occurs. And then the value condition is this idea that the expected value of allowing suffering must be positive when the greater good is taken into account. So this is the idea that the good must outweigh the disvalue of the suffering. It must not just even be equal to, but generally greater. Now, obviously, we cannot quantify this. We cannot say, oh, this greater good has, 0.8 value of good, and the evil or suffering experience has 0.6. You can't do it in that way. But there's sort of an intuitive understanding that if I was to bring forward a certain good, it seems to outweigh the bad. So I'll give you an example. So if I'm walking in the forest and there's a person who I see cutting off the leg of an individual, now I would say, oh my gosh, this is a madman. How could he cut off this leg of this person? And so I will class that person as a morally bad person that is cutting the leg of another individual. But then let's say I go and I try to fight him off and to help the guy that he's cutting the leg and I tried to help that guy, and I tried to push the guy off, and the guy says, no, stop, I'm a doctor, I'm trying to save the individual, he's about to die, I need to amputate his leg. Now the value of that person is now going to change in my mind. Why that is because the action, which is an evil action, it's an action that's bringing about a bad state of affairs, specifically the suffering that's going to be occurring to that individual, the pain of losing a leg, and also the pain, the difficulty of a life of disability without a leg. So there's suffering that's occurring. But we would say that the good that is coming about, that's necessitated by that suffering, that it could only be had by his leg being cut off, is better, and that is the preservation of his life. So we would say in that scenario, even though he's going through an evil, he's going through a suffering experience, there seems to be a positive value that's had by the good that's generated. And so you have those two conditions being met. It's necessitated. You could only have the preservation of life if that person's leg is cut off. But also the value condition is met, that we would say that it seems to be positive, okay, that the person's leg being cut off to preserve his life. However, if someone was to say, we change the scenario, and I was to push off the guy, and I say, stop, why are you cutting off his leg? And he says, well, he wanted me to cut off his leg because, he doesn't like having hairy legs. So I was going to cut his leg off. Now, we would say that even though there is a good that is produced, because maybe it is a good not to have very hairy legs. So it's a good that's been produced, but we wouldn't call that a greater good because the necessity condition isn't met, because maybe that there's another way for him not to have hairy legs, maybe just shaving them. And secondly, even if the necessity condition was met, the value condition isn't met, because it seems to be the losing of a leg outweighs the good of having no hairy legs. So it seems to be, you can see here that different goods can be attached to suffering experiences, and they either need to be necessitated, and the value also has to be greater than the suffering experience. Okay, so What we've seen in the literature so far, and I'm going to start going into my theodicy, firstly, is there are various greater goods that people have put forward. So you have in the literature, the big one that most people will go to is free will. They would say that God, values genuine freedom to choose between good and evil. And even though this freedom enables moral evils, a world with free creatures who sometimes choose good is more valuable than a world of programmed individuals. And so the greater good that's produced here is the freedom of the will. Now, why a lot of people push back on this is because they might say, yes, freedom of the will is the necessity condition is met, but the value condition isn't. It doesn't seem to be that the value of me having free will is greater than the suffering experiences that we have that are widely spread out through reality. And so it seems like it doesn't seem to meet the value condition. We have the soul-making and character developments idea. So this is the idea that suffering creates necessary conditions for moral and spiritual growth. So you have this idea of John Hick. He put forward this view of the veil of soul-making. So creatures develop various virtues like compassion, courage, perseverance. Now, my theodicy is going to be more in line with this one, but it's going to go further than this one. And we'll see how it does. Because this problem, firstly, just in the way that Hick put it, it doesn't seem to meet the necessity condition. Even though in some circumstances it might meet the value one, we might say character development is very good, and sometimes it does outweigh suffering. But what we would say is the necessity condition isn't met for animals, according to Hick's idea. So it doesn't seem to work for a very large array of suffering that's going on in our world today, and it's gone on throughout history. So as it is developed in the literature by Hick, it doesn't seem to have the necessity condition because there are many suffering experiences that go on for animals, which according to Hick's idea, there isn't sort of this development here. So you have a problem. People might say also relationship with God. So suffering can lead to deeper, more intimate knowledge of God and oneself. A good that can outweigh the suffering it entails. So the idea here is that it allows people to have more intimate knowledge with God. They're able to develop a union with God. Again, this might be good, but it does seem to have limitations. Stump will argue that this is the greatest valuable thing that you can have. And a lot of people might go with that, saying that a relationship of union with God, where you have deep union with God, is the greatest thing. So you have the value condition, but the necessity condition doesn't seem to be met. Because some people might say, well, what about people who have relationship and deep union with God who are not going through the suffering? So the people that went through the Holocaust, for example, had horrific suffering. And let's say some people were brought to their knees and became Christians or whatever religion you want to affirm, given their suffering. There are many people who have deep relationships with God who do not have that type of suffering. So it seems to be that doesn't meet the necessity condition. Swinburne's one, you have this idea that responsibility and service to natural evils provide opportunities for humans to develop knowledge and exercise responsibility and be of service to one another. So this is Swinburne's idea. Again, some people just might say the value of responsibility, the value of service doesn't seem to outweigh the idea of suffering and the great horrendous suffering that people have gone through. It's great that I can be responsible for my actions and it allows me to do this. It allows me to be of service to others through my suffering, but it doesn't seem to be that there is great value that's given that outweighs a lot of the suffering that people are going through. There's other ones as well. Knowledge, it develops more knowledge. This is Swinburne's idea as well, that it allows us to have things like scientific knowledge, that if we didn't have natural evil, then we wouldn't have that. So you seem to have a problem here, though, however, of accounting for the value condition. Yes, it's great to have scientific knowledge, but again, would a lot of people say that I would allow my kid to die from cancer because it allows people to be able to research better and have better understandings of how cancer works? I think a lot of people say, no, I'd rather have my kid being alive and not suffering. So there's many challenges that these theodicies have. You have the distribution problem, so outside of the ones I've already spoken about. It just seems like there's a lot of horrors that happen to a lot of people. So you seem to have a lot of horrors happening to many people, but then it doesn't happen to others. So you seem to have a lot of suffering that's happening in some regions, but it doesn't happen to other regions. So what's happening there? What's going on here? And is soul making, for example, has this big problem that there's a lot of soul making in some countries where there's high poverty, high mortality rates. But what about countries that are better off financially, economically? They're probably not going through soul making as much. So why would God do it in that way? The severity problem as well. It seems to be the suffering is excessive beyond what we need to be able to bring about the good. It can character crush as well. So suffering often destroys rather than develops character. And then, as I was saying as well, animal suffering, we don't seem to have good explanations for this. You also have the idea of instrumentalization. So it seems to be that God uses people as means to an end. Um, and so is this something that God will want to do? And so this seems to be a problem that people are brought up with Hick and Swinburne as well. A last one as well is that it seems to be that we allow or we frame animal suffering in terms of human suffering. So it seems to devalue animals' intrinsic worth. So a lot of people, Swinburne sometimes in his work, he might indicate that animals suffer and they have a benefit for humans in their suffering. But again, that seems to just number one, it doesn't account for a lot of unseen animals that are not seen by humans and they were existing before humans and suffering. But also, it doesn't seem to show that animals have their own intrinsic value. What about, does God care about them or does he just care about the humans? Okay, so now we're going to start moving on to my own theodicy. So I've put up a real challenge in trying to put forward this idea because there's a lot of things that I need to deal with in my theodicy. Hopefully, I'm able to do that, and I'll love to hear feedback from people. Just to show, how this is sort of a joint enterprise in trying to understand what's the best theodicy available, if there is one. So my theodicy, as I'm putting it forward, is called the Exemplarist Theodicy. And so there's sort of a connection between my theodicy and the greater good framework. So I'm going to break down the theodicy in a few minutes, but I'm just going to go through how there's a connection here before I go to that. So the exemplarist theodicy satisfies the greater good criteria through the logically necessary connection between suffering and exemplar transformation. So how exemplar transformation functions as a greater good, creative flourishing through exemplarity meets both necessity and value conditions for justifying suffering. So the idea here is that I'm going to put forward this idea that the greater good that's produced by suffering is the idea of creative flourishing. Okay, that God wants people to flourish and he wants them to flourish creatively. And this can only be had by suffering. And so the transformation of individuals into exemplars of morality who ground moral concepts and spread goodness through their communities is what I take to be creative flourishing. So humans and animals, are able to flourish creatively by becoming exemplars of morality, grounding morality within their circumstances, and spreading goodness throughout whatever community they're part of. So the good is not merely creatures receiving benefits from God, but creatures actively participate as grounds of morality and co-creators with God. So this enables creatures to serve as reference points for moral concepts. So for example, what is courage? What is compassion? What is empathy? All of these things are not grounded, actually are epistemically by God, even though ontologically, some people might say they're grounded in God or metaphysically, but epistemically, they're not grounded in God. They're grounded in his creatures. We know what goodness is like because we know what an exemplar who's shown what goodness is like. And so that's how we are able to learn through teaching, through their example, and through their influence. So reality, I will argue, where creatures actively participate as grounds of morality has greater value than one where creatures merely passively receive goods or exist biologically without any type of development. So we're going to see that the necessity condition is satisfied. Suffering is logically necessary for exemplar transformation, not merely contingently useful. And so what we're going to see is that there is a connection between suffering and exemplarity in a logical way. So that strong sense of necessity that we're looking for, that God, even being omnipotent, could not create exemplars without the possibility of suffering. But we're also going to see that the value condition is satisfied. So we're going to see that the good of creative flourishing outweighs the disvalue of suffering. Why this is the case is because we're going to see that creative flourishing represents a supreme created good. Creatures are participating actively in making the world good rather than merely existing in it. And so from the sufferer's perspective, transformed exemplars themselves wouldn't want to be without their exemplarity given the suffering required. So we're going to see that the suffering is not just good for God, good for the world, good for the communities that are existing, but also good for the person who's transformed into exemplar. we'll see that the exemplar seems to be someone who's going to be valuable, but valuable in such a sense that they would not want to let go of their exemplarity, even if they knew that the suffering was something which was required for it. But we're also going to see that there are people who we can call non-exemplary sufferers. So these are individuals who cannot themselves, for whatever reason, become exemplars. And so we're going to see that they're going to receive compensation from God in the basis of a relationship with him and participation in the community of exemplars. So we're going to see that the vast good realized through creative flourishing, that is the emergence of exemplars who ground morality and spread goodness across all creation, decisively outweighs the disvalue of suffering itself. So let's now start moving into defining what the theodicy is. So God permits suffering to enable, one, the transformative process through which individuals become exemplars of morality, or two, provide opportunities for others to undergo such transformation, ultimately achieving creative flourishing. So the idea here is that God is permitting suffering. And so if someone asks, well, why does God allow suffering? Well, someone would say there are two possible reasons here. God allows suffering because it provides the means by which a transformative process for individuals to become exemplars can be realized. So the transformative process through which individuals become exemplars of morality explains why God allows suffering, or it provides opportunities for others to undergo such transformation. So that second one is important because it deals with those who aren't going to go through the transformative process themselves, or they are going through it and it gets cut short before they become exemplars. And so the second one will be that they provide these opportunities through their own suffering for others themselves to transform. So we see that the primary function of suffering is that God permits suffering because it serves as a logically necessary condition for the transformation of individuals into exemplars. But the secondary function is that when suffering does not transform the individual, it provides opportunities for others to transform into exemplars through their responses. So the ultimate purpose, both function as realizations of creative flourishing. They both function as aims that God has for his creation. He wants his creation to be in a certain way. And becoming exemplars through transforming through their suffering or providing others with the opportunity to do so enables creatures to participate actively as grounds of morality, either directly through their own transformative process or indirectly by enabling others to go through this transformative process. So the theodicy operates through either the sufferer's own transformation or by enabling transformation in those who respond to the suffering. So as I've said already, there's this logically necessary condition here. Suffering is not merely compatible with God's goodness, but it's logically necessary for human creative flourishing through exemplar transformation. So it's not a causal connection, but it's something which God, if he is perfectly good, will want to bring about, and he can only bring about if there is suffering. And so what this idea that I have here is something that I want people to really wrestle with is, so I'll just skip forward just slightly so people have this image as well. So creative flourishing is made possible by humans transforming to exemplars or enabling others to do so. And so creative flourishing involves creatures actively participating in making the world good. So if you are to creatively flourish, as I use that term, you are a creature, but you're a creature who's going to be an active participant in making the world into a certain type of way, making the world a good world. And the way you do that through your life is through becoming an exemplar, because you will ground morality in your community. People will point to you as being good, and so they will understand what goodness is. And so they would be able to see what an exemplar is through your life. And so you would play a role then in spreading goodness. Now, the way, though, that I've sort of already hinted at this, but it'll be good to just state this more fully. So there are two pathways I have in my mind here about how people can creatively flourish. So you have the direct transformation, So that's individuals themselves undergo the process of becoming exemplars through their experience of and response to suffering. And then you have the indirect transformation. So that is the individual suffering provides occasions for others to develop exemplary virtues and become exemplars through their responses. So unlike passive reception of goods, creative flourishing requires creatures to be active agents in their own moral development and in spreading goodness to others. But there's also community impact. Exemplars don't merely possess virtues privately, but serve as grounds of morality and sources of moral knowledge for their communities through teaching, modeling, and inspiring others. So through becoming exemplars, and this is a really key one, especially for Christian theism, that through becoming exemplars, creatures participate more fully in God's own exemplary nature. Because the idea of participation, so this idea of theosis, becoming one with God and participating in the divine nature, this is one aspect of it. By becoming good as God is, becoming a ground of morality as God is as well, and becoming someone who spreads goodness around the world like God does, you are participating in the creative act of God and also in the divine nature. Now, if we just look at the images that we have here, let's say we just take an eagle eye view or God's eye view of reality. And we say prior to the creative act, God had two choices. He already decided that he wanted to bring about human beings. He wanted to bring about animals. So he wanted to bring about conscious life in the planet we called Earth. And he was thinking as well, I'm a good being and I want to diffuse goodness around reality. So I want to bring about good things in whatever I create. And so he has two, let's say there are two options that God could say, how I'm going to make my world into a good world. The first way is, if we just look at that first image, is where God decides that he's going to create animals and humans, and he's going to put a moral law in their heart. Okay. Now, the Christian idea obviously is that the law is written in our hearts, and I affirm that fully. But let's say that from our birth, there is an explicit Ten Commandments that is embedded into our souls, that we just know automatically that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not, bear false witness, all those things that we take to be the moral laws. Let's say that that's written into our heart from the beginning. Now, the thing is that we will have people being good. We will have the goodness of a creation where there are good beings around. But there will be something lacking. There will be a lacking of a participatory element in God's creative act. Because what God has decided to do is that he's decided to create the material world as it is, creatio ex nihilo, out of nothing. But then he's also gone further and said, I'm going to also make the world, not just materially, but also axiologically. I'm going to make the world into a good world by myself. Everyone's going to be good because I've made them good and I've put goodness automatically within themselves. And so seems to be a lacking of any type of creative role that God has given to humans. But he still gets the good world that he wants. But there seems to be another good that's missing, participation in God's creation. So there is another idea that God could have had, which was, instead of me saying I'm going to create the world materially, which I'm going to do by myself, but I'm going to create the world materially, but I'm going to also leave it open axiologically how the world is going to end up. But I'm not just going to leave it by itself deistically and say I'm going to create the world and there's just going to be a reality that exists and that's it, and everyone's going to figure out how to live morally. But what God is going to do is that he's going to create a system, an exemplarist system, where we have humans. Let's just leave animals to the side for a second, but we have humans. And humans are going to go through various experiences in their life. And through responding admirably to those experiences, they are going to change themselves and develop themselves in such a way that they are going to become admirable people. Because, and I don't go into depth here because this is a summary picture, but in my previous work on this, if people want to look it up, on the problem of suffering, and in the forthcoming monograph, the idea of being an exemplar is defined as the most admirable person. So you become an exemplar if you are admirable, or you're the most admirable person. And so admirability is key for the way that exemplarism works. So I develop various virtues. I transform and become the most admirable person. But when I become admirable, that is very important, not just for myself, but also for the wider community that I'm within. Because something that's linked to admirability is also the idea of emulation. When you admire someone, you normally want to become like them. So, for example, I'm big on American football, even though I'm in the UK, and I love Kansas City Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes is unbelievable. Now, if I could have been living another life, I would have loved to be a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, but I just do not have the skill level that he does at all. But I look up to him, and if I was younger and I was in high school, I would say I'm going to train like Patrick Mahomes. I'm going to watch his videos. I'm going to copy his style. I'm going to do all of this. And there are even some college players, one Nebraska quarterback who does this, who's very simple, trying to be like Patrick Mahomes. And so, yeah, there's this idea that when you admire someone, you want to be like them. So admirability has something linked to it of emulation. So when you admire someone, you want to be like them. And so when you train to be like someone a lot, you end up actually becoming like them, such that you might not be exactly like them. You might not be the perfect copy. There's never going to be a Patrick Mahomes. There's never going to be another Tom Brady. But they're going to be people who are very close to them because of the way that they've been able to emulate their lives. And so the idea here is that when someone admires someone and emulates them, they then transform and take on the status that of the person that they are emulating or they're admiring. And so this is the same thing with goodness. When we look to individuals who are good, we admire them and we want to emulate them. We want to live their life. And this is specifically so clear in Christian teaching that we are to emulate the person of Christ. But also, interestingly, Paul even says something even more interesting. And he says that as he has imitated Christ, we are to imitate him. So he's saying there's even a chain now of emulation. He emulates Christ, and then he was saying to the church he was writing to, you are to emulate me, because they don't have Christ living with them, but they have Paul, who's already admired and become like Christ in his life. So the idea here is that in an exemplarist system, when someone transforms through their experiences into an exemplar, they then become an admirable person, and others in their community will want to emulate them and thus also become good like them. And through living their lives and experiencing the experiences that they go through and responding to them virtuously as the exemplar did, they then over time become themselves exemplars of morality. And then as the chain continues, there is another person who looks at that individual who's now an exemplar, and so on and so forth. And so if you see that second image, you have the way that goodness now is spreading around the world is not because God has put the moral law and just embedded it in everyone or written it in the sky, but he's actually done it through a creative process where someone themselves decides to respond virtuously to their suffering. They then acquire the virtues that make them into the exemplar. They become admirable, and other people want to emulate them. And then they themselves, over time, doing the same thing, responding virtuously to their suffering, they then become exemplars, and so on and so forth. And so the way that goodness spreads around the world is through this action of living as an exemplar. So what we have here are people become exemplars by grounding morality. So they are now who we look to understand what goodness is. For example, Christ is the supreme exemplar for Christians. We look to him to understand what it means to live a good life. What does it mean to be patient and kind and loving? We look to the person of Christ. Muslims, if they are, Islamic theists, they would look to Muhammad as someone who's an exemplar for them. So you can see within other different theistic traditions, this is something which is already embedded there, this exemplarism. So the idea here is that I believe that a valuable world that God will create is one that where we can be co-creators with God, in that we ourselves can make the world into a good world. So God creates the world materially, but we have the role in creating the world axiologically. Thus that we, through our lives, exemplars, we can actually change the world and make it into a good world. So what we then have is that we seem to have the supreme good of creative participation. which just seems to go, I would say, it provides a way to justify suffering. Why does suffering occurs? Because it brings about creative flourishing. Creative flourishing is that of becoming an exemplar, being a co-creator with God in making the world into a good world through your exemplarism, where you ground morality and you spread goodness through your life. Others emulate you and they themselves become exemplars, leading to the creation of a good world. So I believe that God will prioritize enabling creatures' transformations, exemplars, over protecting them from all suffering, because he knows that suffering will bring about this good for himself, for the communities, for the world, and for the individual as well. So divine goodness aims ultimately at creative flourishing rather than immediate comfort. And that's what we really need to understand here in this idea. And so all suffering is ultimately redeemed through enabling creatures to participate actively in making the world a good world. So why this specific process? We're going to see in a minute that there is a four-stage transformative process. Because some people might say, okay, this sounds great, but how does suffering actually really work in this sort of theodicy? How does it play a role? So we're going to see that there's a four-stage process, that we're going to see how suffering is necessary for each of these stages. And so we're going to see how suffering will ultimately outweigh the evil. But what we can say now is generally a world with creative flourishing through exemplarity, despite requiring suffering, has greater overall value than a world without suffering, but also without this form of participation. Okay, so as I was saying, there is a four-stage transformative process. So transformation into exemplar. An exemplar occurs through a sequential developmental process where suffering plays an essential role at every stage. So there are four stages. So the idea here is I don't just become an exemplar overnight. It's going to be something which is a process. And I believe that there are four stages that a person will go through in becoming an exemplar. Now, this is not temporally sort of sequential. So it's not like you go through stage one to stage two, stage three. It's just saying that there are going to be these four ingredients that at least need to be there. And there might be more, and it might be spread out over time, but you're going to be doing these four things in order to become an exemplar. So stage one is the idea of participating in the basic goods. So to become an exemplar, this requires that one participates in the basic goods of reality. That is life, knowledge, friendship, aesthetic experience, because exemplars must recognize and pursue what generally matters for flourishing before they can embody and teach his good to others. So this draws from the work of John Finnis, specifically with his natural law. Now, I'm going to, with the constructive theodicy, bringing together a lot of philosophical concepts that people might already know from other areas. But the key thing here is you don't have to be fully committed to what the other person is arguing for. So by having this within the theodicy, the idea of basic goods doesn't necessarily mean it entails that you have to hold to natural law theory. You can hold to another deontological theory. If you want to, you can hold to consequentialist theory. If you want to, you can hold to, a divine, let's say the idea of, God being the ground of morality. So it's really up to you morally how you want to sort of bring about your ethical framework within this theodicy. But the idea here is that there are various concepts, because something for your audience to know is that philosophy of religion, according to what I do, as I define it, and also this is sort of building on Swinburne's work, is an investigation or investigation using the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy to analyze the meaning and justification of religious claims. So when you're doing philosophy of religion, you're looking at a religious claim and you're using the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy to either clarify the meaning of that claim or to justify it. And so at the moment now, we're trying to justify God's existence. And so I'm going to be using various analytic philosophy concepts to make sense of this. So anyways, the key point here is what we see in stage one is this idea of basic goods. And so people might already know about the idea of basic goods, but there are at least 7 basic goods, and I'm going to go through this in more depth. And the idea here is for me to become an exemplar, I need to at least be participating in these basic goods, because these basic goods are basic in the sense of they are necessary for a flourishing life. So if I'm going to flourish as a human being, I need to at least be participating fully in these 7 basic goods. Okay, and then the idea here is that suffering has a role at this stage. So suffering provides the contrast that enables recognition and appreciation of the basic goods. And it also provides feedback indicating the gaps between current and potential states of flourishing. So I'm going to break this down a lot more in depth, but the idea here is that in order for me to be an exemplar, I need to participate in the basic goods of reality. But then suffering is going to have to play a role in me being able to fully participate in these basic goods in this stage. Stage two is the exercising of self-formation. So to become an exemplar, this requires that one exercises genuine self-formation through character-defining choices between exemplary traits. Because exemplary traits must arise from deep features of one's own psychology rather than mere inheritance, temperament, or external imposition. So the idea here is that in this stage, or in this idea of becoming an exemplar, I don't just need to participate in the basic goods, but I also need to play a role in genuinely forming myself. So through making various character-defining choices, I'm going to develop myself, or I'm going to develop my will in a certain way such that I'm going to be able to be attuned towards living a virtuous life. And so self-formation is very key here. Again, this doesn't necessarily require libertarian free will. I do draw from the work of a few philosophers such as Robert Caine. So I use his work to make sense of self-formation, but it doesn't necessarily lead to you having to alter libertarian free will. This could work maybe in a compatibilist way. That'll be interesting to see how this cashes out there. But the key thing is at stage two, there is an idea of exercising self-formation. I need to make character-defining choices in order to become an exemplar. But then suffering is going to also play a role at this stage. Suffering creates the internal tension within self-forming action that elevates the choices from mere preferences to profound acts of character creation. So the idea here is suffering is going to provide the tension needed to make my choices self-forming. And we're going to see how this works. Stage three is the acquisition of virtues. So to become an exemplar requires that one acquires stable, virtuous character traits, because exemplars serve as reference points, as we've seen from moral concepts. What is courage? What is compassion? That's going to be grounded upon the exemplar in that community. And so they must consistently embody these excellences across various contexts. So suffering is going to have a role at this stage. Suffering is going to provide the necessary adversity for developing virtues. And there are three types of exemplars, virtuous exemplars, that we're going to see. This again draws from the work of Linda Zagrebski with her exemplarism. And there are three virtuous exemplars you can have. You can have someone called the sage, which is the wisdom exemplar. You have the hero, which is sort of the courageous exemplar, and you have the saint, who is the, as it says, sort of the saintly exemplar. And I'm going to break these all down, but the idea here is that there are various types of exemplars that you can become relative to virtues that you acquire. But in order to become these exemplars, you need to go through suffering. And then stage four, the last stage, undergoing transformative experiences. So to become an exemplar requires that one undergoes experiences that fundamentally transform both knowledge and identity, because exemplarity is not merely possessing virtues, but having one's entire character integrated around moral excellence through profound personal change. So the idea here is that to complete the process of becoming an exemplar, I'm going to undergo something called a transformative experience. So this draws the work from the work of L.A. Paul, and on her work of transformative experiences. And the idea here is that there are two types of transformative experiences. There are personal transformative experiences, and there's epistemic transformative experiences. And the idea here is that you need, in order to undergo these transformative experiences, which lead to you becoming an exemplar, there's going to need to be suffering here, because suffering provides the intensity, novelty, and the attentional focus that is necessary for experiences that are both epistemically transformative, so providing you with otherwise inaccessible knowledge, and personally transformative, fundamentally altering your values and character. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is break this down, go through the stages. I'm going to speed up a little bit so we don't spend too much time. But the key thing is we're seeing now how this works out. So how does suffering work within these stages, leading to you to become an exemplar? So participation in the basic goods. So human flourishing centers on participation in fundamental goods that constitute the well-being of an individual. So we have fundamental constituents of well-being and flourishing. So we have these basic goods, which we will take to be the fundamental things that we need to live well and to flourish as human beings. And so these key goods include life, which is existence and vitality, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, play, recreation and enjoyment, aesthetic experience, beauty and stimulation, sociability, friendship and community, practical reasonableness, which is sound decision making. And then there's this idea of proto-religious awareness. So Finnis just uses the word religion, but he doesn't really just mean that in order to be uh, a flourishing human, you have to be religious in the sense of holding to a revealed religion. He doesn't mean that. He just means that you need to have an awareness of the transcendence. That's the key thing here. So in order for this specific good to hold, you need to not just live a life that is very, I would say, earthly focused, but you need to have an understanding that there are questions about ultimate reality, and that's something that you're going to be directed towards to live a flourishing life. So just to unpack this more, so we have these basic goods, and these basic goods make a life a good life. And so every human being should be aiming for these goods. You want to live a life, well, you want to have a life, so that is the first basic good. But you want to have a healthy life. That's why we privilege health. That's very important. But we also want to have knowledge. We don't just want to have a life of ignorance. We want to have a life where we understand things, where we develop as human beings, where we gain knowledge about things. And this can just be for knowledge's sake. So for the intrinsic value of having knowledge. So it's not just instrumentally that I'm going to have knowledge because it's going to allow me to do things, but it's the idea here that we want to gain knowledge for its sake. That's why we do a lot of, let's say, scientific research, which is not going to lead to actually any practical relevance in our discoveries, but it's good for its own sake. So knowledge is something that we aim for, but we also aim for play. We see it's very good that we have recreation and enjoyment. We see, as I was saying, it's great to love American football. It's great to love soccer or football in my country. It's great to love basketball. It's great to love dance. It's great to listen to music and play instruments. These things are things that we see as part of life. And when they're removed from life, we see that there's a certain type of good that is being removed from the human existence and well-being. We also see aesthetic experience as being a great good. We see beauty, that could be artistic expression, but we also see the beauty of the world as being a very important thing. Experiencing things aesthetically is very important to flourishing. We see sociability being important. We see having friends, having a community, living in a well-ordered society. Why do we privilege order within society over chaos? Because we see having a social life as being something which is important to the flourishing of the human being. We also see practical reasonableness as important. This is the idea that we want to order our own lives, not just our communities, but our own lives in a fashion that's going to lead to successful results. So we want to be able to make sound decision making in our lives. I don't just wake up and say, I'm just going to randomly do things in my life. I do things because they're going to lead to certain goals being fulfilled. And so we want to act in reasonable ways practically. But then the last one is we also want to be aware of the transcendent. We want to be aware of there being a reality more than ourselves. Even if it is you're a naturalist or you're a materialist and you see that the natural world is all that there is, we still want to answer that question. Well, what is it for the natural world to be all that there is? So we want to have our ultimate questions answered, and we have focus on those things as well. So we see these goods as being goods that are fundamental to the well-being of a human and the flourishing of a human life. But then what I'm going to say is that suffering has, if this is the case, that these are basic goods that humans are needing to participate in, suffering is going to have two roles in enabling a full participation in these basic goods. The first idea is suffering provides contrast. That is, the recognition of goods requires differentiation from their absence or opposite, making contrast logically necessary. So this is the idea that for any good to be recognized as such, there must be contrast or possibility of its absence. This follows from the structure of value recognition itself. So without experiencing or understanding the possibility, for example, of pain, We cannot identify safety as valuable. Without vulnerability, security has no meaning. Without illness, health cannot be appreciated as a positive state. So this is not just something which is to do with human psychology, but it's about the logical structure of evaluative concepts. Good requires differentiation from not good to have content. So contrast makes goods vivid rather than background conditions. Hunger makes food generally desirable rather than merely available. Loneliness makes companionship precious rather than merely present. So the contrast provided by suffering generates urgency in pursuing goods. Comfort motivates action only when discomfort is possible. Safety drives behavior only when danger threatens. So without contrast, the goods that we've looked at fade into taken for granted background habituation. So things that we just do for habit. But the idea here is that suffering prevents us by repeatedly highlighting what matters. And so what we have just with this idea is that in order for me really to be able to understand what these goods are, I need to understand what their absence is or what the opposites of them are, to be able to fully appreciate them, to participate in them fully. So for someone who always has good health, for example, they're participating in the good, the good of the good of life, the basic good of life. But having also illness given to them, they're going to be able to understand what it means to have health. And so they're going to seek good health a lot more than they would if they were just living a good life. They would want to seek it and have a deeper participation in it. So the idea here is that suffering provides that contrast that we need to be able to differentiate and also motivate us to want to go and live a fully participatory life in all of those basic goods. If I'm always with friends, I'm participating in the good of sociability, but me having experience of the contrast of loss or loneliness, I'm going to appreciate so much more that basic good, be motivated to deeply participate in a lot more, and to also understand what it means. So it's not even just about motivation and appreciation, but it's also understanding this is a good. The good that I have, a friendship, when I also experience its opposite. So the idea here is that suffering provides this contrast in order for this full participation to take place. But then also suffering can act as a feedback indicator. So suffering functions as an evaluative signal, identifying gaps between actual and potential states of flourishing. So suffering alerts individuals that current states fall short of possible states. So for example, physical pain indicates injury that prevents full functioning. Emotional distress signals relational or psychological needs that are unmet. So the idea here is that the aversive character of suffering combined with the desire for its cessation, if you remember that's what our definition of suffering is, creates powerful motivation to pursue the goods more fully. Discomfort drives seeking comfort. Dissatisfaction prompts seeking satisfaction. So without suffering as feedback, beings would remain in unchanging equilibrium with no impetus to develop, to grow, to actualize latent capacities. It's like a thermostat without temperature feedback. So suffering doesn't just signal something is wrong, but it indicates direction of improvement. Hunger, as I said before, points toward food. Loneliness points toward community. Ignorance points towards knowledge. So the intensity of suffering calibrates how urgently goods should be pursued. Mild discomfort suggests minor adjustments, but severe suffering demands immediate attention. So through various feedback cycles, individuals learn which states promote flourishing and which undermine it, and they develop practical wisdom about pursuing the basic goods. So what we have here is suffering has a role in this first stage because it provides a needed contrast and it provides a feedback indicator. And these things are going to allow the full participation in the basic goods. And if you remember, the stage one is that basic fundamental level for becoming an exemplar. I can't be an exemplar if I'm not participating in the full sense of the basic goods. If I'm just not living a good life, I'm not trying to live as an ordered society, or I'm not appreciating the aesthetic greatness of our creation. I'm not, all these things that we see as being things that make someone flourishing as a human. the exemplar needs to participate in this in a good sense, but we would say they need to participate in it fully, not just passively, but really actively pursuing these things. And so suffering allows that full participation. It allows someone to participate because of the contrast and the feedback that it gives. Now, key thing, I'm not saying that it's necessary for the participation in it. You can participate in all these things without suffering, but it's for the full participation. An exemplar will be someone we will take to fully participate in the basic goods. Now, let's move on to stage two, the exercising of self-formation. So, the nature of self-formation. So this is the idea of authentic character formation occurs through self-forming actions where individuals actively create their moral identity. So we have this idea of SFAs. These are self-forming actions. So if you have a time span of a person's life and you have T1, T2, and T3, let's say we take T2 as being a moment of an SFA, a self-forming action. Then we take this T2 to be a pivotal moment when an individual actively shapes their own character through deliberate choices. So the idea here is that we have many choices that we make, but not many of our choices are character forming. But there are some times when we have to make choices that are character forming. So I give you the example that Robert Kane gave. It's a famous example that he gave in his own formulation of this. So this is, he gave this example of this woman who's walking to a business meeting and she's running late, and she sees a homeless person who's being beaten up. And she could do something about it. She could stop, call the police, and try and help the man. Or she could just decide, you know what, I'm too late for my meeting. I need to walk and I'm going to ignore this and go to my meeting. And let's say that if she goes to the meeting, she knows she's going to deliver a presentation that's going to allow her to be promoted to a partner of her law firm. But let's say that she stays on. She's going to miss out that meeting. She's going to not be promoted, and she's just going to continue on with her role. So she's missing out on a really great good that's happening to her life by helping this person. But by helping this person, she's also going to help this person maybe save their life potentially, because maybe they have life-threatening injuries. And so this is an SFA. Because there are many actions that she made that morning, many choices she made. She walked out the house as a choice. She maybe ate her breakfast as a choice. She got her clothes on. She brushed her teeth. She got in her car. She got in her car, maybe parked it, and then was walking to the meeting. And so she did all of these choices, but those weren't SFAs. The one that was an SFA was when she was in that pivotal moment when she could make a choice that would actively shape the type of person she was going to be. Is she going to be a selfish person who's going to favor her own good, her own flourishing, or is she going to be someone who's going to be selfless? Those are the SFAs. Those are the pivotal moments. And so SFAs occur when individuals face conflicting motivations or values and must resolve tension through their own efforts. So the resolution is not predetermined, but genuinely open. So these actions produce traits that arise from deep features of the person's psychology rather than mere inheritance. So this is the time when someone is going to now produce a trait that's going to develop their character so much so in a certain way. So this, I argue, is essential for exemplarity. So now we're moving forward in another essential element to be an exemplar. Without SFAs, one cannot progress beyond merely appreciating goods to actually embodying exemplary character. And so what we're going to see then is that suffering plays a role in the SFAs. For an SFA to even occur, there must be suffering. And how we know this is because there are multi-layered choices in an SFA, and so there are multi-layered suffering in SFAs. So self-forming actions involve suffering across multiple simultaneous dimensions, creating complex internal resistance. So there are three dimensions of suffering. We have sensory level. There is physical pain and discomfort, creating immediate aversion. So physical pain generates bodily resistance to certain courses of action. So exhaustion makes continued effort physically difficult. Injury creates visceral deterrence. Bodily discomfort creates immediate non-negotiable pressure against certain choices. The body's aversive reactions must be overcome through will. So, for example, a rescuer must push through burning muscles and shortness of breath to save someone. An athlete endures pain to continue training. So the sensory dimensions ensures choices have tangible physical cost, making them generally difficult rather than merely abstract. So the idea here is that we have suffering at just with an SFA at the sensory level. the most basic level, there's going to be physical pain when you are in a lot of choices that we have to make. So, for example, that rescuer who's making an SFA decision, he's making something that's self-forming by maybe running into the burning building. He's going to have burning muscles. He's going to have shortness of breath. He's going to be feeling sick and ill. There's going to be physical pain, physical suffering that's going to play a role in him going through that SFA. If there wasn't that physical suffering, then that wouldn't be an SFA in that scenario, because that person would have just walked into that room, helped them, and that wouldn't be a real costly decision that they have to make. So there's that sensory dimension to an SFA. There is also an emotional level. There's anxiety, fear, guilt, or distress, which accompanies difficult choices. So anxiety about uncertain outcomes creates psychological pressure during decision making. Fear of failure, rejection, or harm generates emotional resistance. Guilt about past actions or potential consequences weigh heavily. Distress from contemplating difficult options creates internal turmoil. So, for example, a whistleblower who experiences intense anxiety about career destruction and isolation, or someone choosing forgiveness battles anger and resentment. So in some other SFAs, there's going to be an emotional level of suffering. There's going to be anxiety, fear, guilt, which is brought in. But these things need to be there for that SFA to take place. The whistleblower is not going to have a self-forming action that they're going to need to perform. That's going to develop their character if there is no anxiety about what's going to happen. That anxiety is playing a role there because it's something big that they're going to have to make that could potentially destroy their career. Or someone who's forgiving someone is going to be feeling anger and resentment, and that's going to be there necessarily in order for them to go through that SFA action of forgiveness. That's not saying every action of forgiveness is an SFA, but many actions of forgiveness are SFAs because of that suffering, that mental suffering of anger and resentment. So you have the emotional dimension, which engages the whole person. It's not just a rational calculation. Ensuring choices for SFAs are psychologically costly. And then there's a moral level as well. There's conflict between competing values, duties, or commitments. So genuine moral dilemmas arise when multiple legitimate values cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. Tension between duty to one person and duty to another, between personal integrity and loyalty, between justice and mercy. So, for example, a doctor choosing between respecting patient autonomy and preventing harm, or a parent balancing equal treatment with special attention to a struggling child. So what we have with this idea is that the moral dimension elevates choices from preference to identity. Who am I becoming, rather than merely what do I want? So we also have SFAs that have suffering when it comes to the moral level. There's going to be these competing values that the person really has a struggle to make. So that doctor has a real struggle in what they're doing in making that decision. That parent has a real struggle as well. So the idea here is that it creates the essential tension that we need. So that internal resistance provided by suffering enables genuine character formation through effortful choice. So this idea of internal resistance, suffering provides the weight against which character is formed. Just as muscles require resistance to develop, moral character requires the opposing force of suffering to overcome. Also, the elevation of choice. Tension transforms choices from trivial preferences into profound acts of self-creation. The difficulty makes the choice consequential for identity, not merely for outcomes. So without suffering-induced tension, character traits are accidents of temperament rather than authentic achievements that are earned through struggle. The difficulty validates that character is generally one's own. Suffering also serves as the essential context that both tests and transforms character. So again, like metal that's refined through heat, character is purified and strengthened through adversity. So we can think more of concrete examples of self-forming actions through suffering. So we can see how this suffering-induced tension actually enables character-defining choices. So, for example, choosing to remain faithful to principles despite temptation and consequent suffering. So, for example, we can go with the journalist who refuses to reveal a source despite legal threats and career damage. The physical stress, the emotional fear, and moral conflict between professional integrity and self-preservation creates severe tension that forms steadfast character. Or let's say you have an example of deciding to forgive despite the pain of betrayal. Someone chooses to forgive a spouse's infidelity despite overwhelming anger and desire for revenge. The physical manifestations of emotional pain, intense resentment, and moral tension between justice and mercy make this a profoundly character-forming choice. Or another one could be committing to difficult long-term goals despite immediate discomfort. So medical student persists through years of exhaustion and sacrifice. The chronic fatigue, anxiety about performance, and tension between immediate desires and long-term commitment develop perseverance and dedication. Or we can have another example. So you have a businesswoman. This is similar to what we were looking at. A businesswoman refuses unethical practices despite financial loss and isolation. So the material deprivation, painful social rejection, and conflict between fitting in and standing apart forge independent moral character. So what we have in this is the idea that suffering plays a role in providing the tension that needs to make a choice, a self-forming choice. If a choice is an easy choice to make, it's not self-forming. Self-forming actions are ones where there's that tension that you have. That could be physical tension at one level. That could be emotional tension at another level. That could be moral tension. So values that are clashing against one another. And so this is the idea that we need this tension that's provided. And that is what suffering is. Suffering, if you remember, is a sensation that a person has that they want to see occurring. And so each of those things, those tensions, emotional, physical, and moral, are all things that people want to stop. They're sensations they're feeling physically, emotionally, or morally, but they want it to stop. And so it is a suffering experience, but that's necessary in order for an SFA to take place. And so for an exemplar to come about, they don't just need to participate in the basic goods. They need to also make self-forming choices to develop their character in a certain way. And so suffering is going to be necessary for them at each of the level, the physical level that might occur, the moral level, the mental level. So these all things these dimensions are going to have suffering playing a role in them. Then we have stage 3, which is the acquisition of virtues. So just understanding the nature of virtues. So we have virtues being moral excellences that manifest through stable character traits organized into 3 exemplar characters. So a virtue is just a moral excellence, something that we take to be a good, something that a character trait that you have that we say is an excellent character trait relative to morality. But it's also a stable character trait. It's not fleeting, something you have. Once you've gained it, you keep it, and we would say that's a virtuous trait a virtuous trait. And so this can be divided into 3 categories for exemplars. So what we have is we have the sage category, we have the hero category, and we have the saint category. So the sage category is characterized by wisdom, insight, and practical reasonableness. The hero is characterized by courage, resilience, fortitude, and perseverance. And the saint is characterized by compassion, charity, empathy, and forgiveness. So you can have virtues and you have very stable character traits that constitute moral excellence. And you can have these that make you into a certain type of exemplar. So you could be the sage, someone who's a wise individual. You have great insight. You are very practically reasonable. You could also be a hero. You could be someone who's very courageous, who's resilient, who perseveres through challenges. Or you could be a saint. You could be someone who's compassionate. You show charity and empathy and forgiveness towards others. Now, someone might be all of these things. So, for example, we take the person of Christ to be all of these 3 things. But also, you can have someone who's just one of these things, or they can be more than one of these things. So the idea here is that you could fall into one of these categories and not be all of them. Now, the idea here is that for each of these categories, each of the acquisition of virtues that are necessary to be this type of exemplar, there's going to be the need of suffering. So firstly, with the sage, wisdom develops through 3 suffering-dependent processes that are unavailable through mere theoretical study. So the first one is appreciation of values through contrast. So wisdom requires deeper understanding of what matters, which comes from experiencing both presence and absence of good. So this is again similar to what we were saying at the first stage, but now this is relative to developing the character wisdom that's needed to be a sage. So you need to be able to understand both the presence and absence of goods. And suffering provides a contrast that makes values stand out as generally important rather than merely theoretical. We'll say someone who understands deeply what a various good is, or what a specific good is someone who's a wise individual. Someone's also going to have knowledge of negative values. So direct experience of suffering provides otherwise inaccessible phenomenological knowledge that the person could not have if they did not actually truly understand pain, loss, injustice, or evil. So you have to experience these things if you really want to be able to teach about these things. If you want to help people through these things, if your wisdom is going to be playing a role in aiding people throughout their pain, their loss, the injustice, or the evil they go through, we are going to say that this experiential knowledge is essential to comprehensive wisdom. The person who's endured through these things, we would say, and has come out as a better person, is a lot wiser relative to these things than if they just knew this through theoretical study. But there's also going to need to be a reflective capacity through adversity. So suffering prompts the contemplative depth essential to wisdom. So adversity forces grappling with meaning, purpose, and value in ways prosperity never demands. So this idea here is that if you are going to be wise, you're going to be able to understand what adversity really is. So adversity, you're going to understand what that is, and then building on that, you're then going to be able to understand what meaning, purpose, and value are within life. But a lot of the time, that can only come from first understanding what adversity is. And so if you're having a life of prosperity, you're never really going to need to know what meaning, purpose, and value is to the greater depth that someone will need to know when they're going through adversity. So the idea here is that prosperity never demands the need to go deeply into the meaning of life, the purpose of life, and the value of life. But someone who's going for adversity, a lot of the time they are motivated and more inclined towards going towards these things. So contemplating suffering and significance develops philosophical insight. And then the last one here is the idea of practical wisdom. So understanding how to respond appropriately to various forms of suffering, when to endure, when to resist, when to help others, develops only through encountering suffering in many of its forms. This practical judgment is core to wisdom. So what we have here is that the sage is someone who's going to develop to become the exemplar of wisdom through their experience of suffering. And then also the hero. So now we have the hero category. So the heroic virtues are defined by their relationship to adversity, making suffering conceptually necessary for their existence. So for example, courage logically requires genuine danger or hardship. One cannot be courageous without fear to overcome or threats to face. Courage is defined as acting rightly despite danger, making danger conceptually necessary. Patience requires prolonged difficulty to develop and display. Forbearance requires enduring injustice or hardship without retaliation. Resilience requires experiencing setbacks and recovering from them. And the idea here is that these virtues aren't merely helped by adversity, but they're defined by their relationship to it. So if you eliminate adversity, this eliminates the logical possibility of these virtues existing. So for the hero to become a hero, for a person to become a hero exemplar, they need to go through suffering. They're going to need to go through suffering so they can acquire courage. They can show patience, forbearance, and resilience that are necessary to be that hero. And in order for them to be able to do that, they need to experience suffering. Then we have the saint. The saint exemplar is someone who has compassionate virtues, and these are inherently relational, and so they require suffering as an object of moral response. So for example, compassion logically requires witnessing or experiencing suffering to respond to. Compassion means suffering with another. Without suffering, there is nothing to be compassionate about. The virtue is defined by its object. Also, sympathy requires the capacity to share emotionally in others' suffering. Empathy requires understanding others' pain through resonance with one's own suffering experience. So empathy involves projecting one's own experience of suffering onto others' situations. Without personal suffering, this resonance is impossible. Also, things like forgiveness, these require having been wronged or offended. And so there's a relational nature. These virtues are inherently relational and other-directed. They exist in response to suffering, making suffering's existence logically necessary for these virtues to be possible. So in order for me to become a saint exemplar, I need to acquire, again, these virtues which can only be had within the context of suffering. Now let's move on to the final stage. So undergoing transformative experiences. So the culminating stage involves experiences that fundamentally alter both knowledge and personal identity. So we have two forms of transformation: epistemically transformative experiences and personally transformative experiences. So epistemically transformative experiences are ones that allow an individual to obtain knowledge through experience that otherwise cannot be attained. So what it's like to face death, lose a loved one, endure injustice. These are only things that you can only have if you've experienced those things. You can't have them. You can't know what it means to face death if you've never faced death. Or you can't know what it really means to lose a loved one if you haven't done that, or endure injustice if you've never gone through that. And then personally transformative, this provides a change to one's values, preferences, and overall character that fundamentally alters the identity of the individual. So they're not just learning new facts, but becoming a different person. So when we experience something that's epistemically transformative, our knowledge is changed. We obtain new knowledge about something, which can only be had through that experience. And if we are personally transformed, what happens through that experience that personally transforms us is that it provides us with new values, new preferences, and a different character and a different identity. So you're not just learning new things about reality, but you're actually becoming a new reality. So this idea of the transformative experiences, it integrates all the previous stages into a coherent, exemplary identity, transforms someone who merely possesses virtues into someone who embodies exemplarity as their fundamental nature. So there are characteristics of transformative experiences, and there's 4 features that distinguish it from ordinary experiences. So a transformative experience is one that has intensity. So strong, powerful experiences that demand full attention and cannot be dismissed. So mild discomfort doesn't break through established patterns or creating lasting change. Also novelty, new and unprecedented experiences that break decisively from routine. So transformative experiences introduce something the person has never encountered before, disrupting equilibrium. And also attention commanding, experiences that cannot be ignored. You cannot just get them through habituation, or they can't just be relegated to the background awareness. They force themselves into your consciousness and remain there. So an example would be if someone went through, let's say, a car crash and survived it. That will be a transformative experience for that person. It could be epistemically, that person learning new things about themselves, but a lot of the time it's going to be a personally transformative one where they are going to have an experience that's so intense, so new because they've never experienced it before, and so attention commanding that their life is going to change after it. Like if they've survived being in the coma, they've just come through it, their life is going to be different. They're not going to be just the same person anymore. Even if they have all their functions, something different is going to have occurred through that experience they went through. And so that is transformative because it's intense, it's novel, and it's attention commanding. So what happens with these experiences is that it becomes a real thing. The transformation occurs not just in beliefs, but in the whole person's orientation to reality. So the idea here is that suffering is essential to this transformation. Firstly, intensity through suffering. So sufficient intensity to break through established patterns and creates lasting change requires suffering. There's a necessity of intensity. Transformative experiences require intensity that commands attention, as I've said already. Suffering provides that intensity. So the severity of suffering often correlates with the transformative efficacy. The more intense the suffering creates, the more powerful transformation. And the reason why is because it cannot be ignored. But it also breaks your equilibrium. Established patterns of thought and behavior, these things are changed now. You don't have them anymore once you go through intense suffering, because there's a shock that's necessary that breaks your pattern and enables you to become fundamentally a different person. That could be for good or for bad. It also creates certain types of memories. So it has intense suffering that someone goes through will create memories that cannot be forgotten. And again, this ensures that the transformation persists. If you just have a mild experience, all of the time those things fade, we forget them. But when you have a profound suffering experience, that leaves a permanent mark. So for example, a near-death experience creates intensity that fundamentally reorders priorities in ways that no theoretical reflection could achieve. Losing a child produces transformation no amount of imagination could replicate. And so I won't go through this more just so I can move on, but the idea here is the same thing for knowledge. You wouldn't have the knowledge that you have unless you went through suffering. So it seems to be that you're given a personally transformative experience through suffering because it's so intense, but there's certain knowledge that's also given to someone. I'll just read the example for this actually. So someone who's experienced severe depression gains knowledge about that state and is categorically different from psychiatric understanding. And someone who's endured injustice understands the injustice in a way that observers cannot. So it seems to be that epistemically, our knowledge is heightened by the suffering experience that we've gone through that's qualitatively different and deeper than any other person's as well. So I won't go through all of this, but because I do want to move on, but it's just the idea here that with this fourth stage, you just have the bringing together or the final push to becoming an exemplar. When you have suffering being part of your experience, that could be on a daily basis, that could be long term. You're going to have epistemic and personal transformation occur. And that's what's needed to push you over to become an exemplar. Because your values become reordered, your identity shifts, you have a persistent change over time. And so what you're going to have is that it's going to just be a different person that comes through this transformation. So the idea here is that it will just provide a profound and fundamental change in your values, identity, and character that allows you to become the exemplar that you are aiming to be. So what we have then is suffering has played a role in being able to show us how to become an exemplar. Firstly, you participate in the basic goods, and suffering is needed for contrast and also for feedback. And then for the second stage, if I'm going to be an exemplar, I can't just participate in the basic goods, but I also need to be able to perform certain self-forming actions, which are going to be character-forming actions. So I'm going to need to be able to create, make choices that are going to have a certain level of, I would say, tension that pulling me in one way or the other, and that's going to be the choice that allows me to develop my character in a certain way. But that tension itself is going to be a suffering experience, and that could be a physical, that could be a mental, that could be emotional, that could be a moral. All of these types of suffering, these dimensions of suffering, are going to be the needed tension that has to be there for me to be able to perform a self-forming action to be an exemplar over time. But then thirdly, I'm going to also need to acquire certain virtues to be an exemplar. And these virtues are going to be enabling me to become exemplars in certain ways. Like I could become a sage, an exemplar with wisdom. I could be an exemplar, a heroic exemplar. That's an exemplar that's related to courage. I could be a saintly exemplar, which is exemplar related to compassion. And so the idea here is, in order for me to acquire wisdom to the depth that's needed to be an exemplar of it, or to be courageous, or to be compassionate, I need to go through suffering experiences. And so again, to be able to become these exemplars, I need to go through suffering in order to acquire the virtues. And then the fourth stage is, I'm going to need to also have suffering occurring for me to have this transformative process to even take place, for me to change epistemically my knowledge, my values, and also for me to change personally in the way that I'm acting, in my identity. There's going to need to be suffering, because suffering provides that novelty, that intensity, and that attentional focus that's needed for someone to change epistemically and personally. And that will complete the process of becoming an exemplar. Okay, so given all of that, someone could ask, okay, that's great. I like that. But what about all the suffering that we have in the world? We have so much suffering in the world, and we seem to have a lot of intense suffering. Is that needed for the exemplar process over those 4 stages? And what I'm going to say is that yes, there is needed for the amount of suffering that we have in the world and the intense amount of suffering, because the correlation between severity and transformative depth explains why extreme suffering serves God's purpose of allowing someone to become an exemplar. Because the objection goes, well, couldn't less suffering achieve the same transformative effects? And I would say no, the severity of suffering correlates with the efficacy in enabling exemplar transformation. That is, the more severe suffering provides a stronger contrast for appreciating goods. The more severe suffering creates a greater tension for self-formation. The more severe suffering offers more profound opportunities for virtue display and acquisition. The more severe suffering produces more intense transformative experiences. So what we have is the greater severity creates greater motivating force for transformation. But also those who transform through greater adversity often demonstrate greater imitable worth as exemplars. That is, the more suffering I've gone through, the more admirable I'm going to become, that people are going to want to be more like me. If I don't go through a lot in my life, and it's not very difficult to become the person I am, a lot of the time it's not going to motivate people more. It's more when people have survived things like the Holocaust, they've survived things like horrible things that have gone through, in their lives, and they've come through that. Now, a lot of the time, it's going to make that person more admirable than the person who went through some suffering, but it was a small amount. So the idea here is that you become more admirable by the greater the suffering that you've gone through, and so that's going to play a role in making you more likely to be emulated by others more deeply and widely. So that's a key thing. So we have here this intense amount of suffering is needed for all of the four stages to have the greatest depth that could be possible for these things to take place. And then also we have, it allows people to have the desire to admire, to emulate you greater, because you're going to become more admirable, and so that will generate more ability in yourself for others to look to you as a person that they want to emulate, and it's going to be more widely seen by this thing. That's why we put up exemplars who have gone through great things in society, because of the great amount of suffering that they've gone through, and more people want to follow them. Okay, so then someone could ask, well, what about people who don't become exemplars? So there could be people who are going through life, and they for whatever reason, maybe they are participating in the basic goods, maybe they are performing self-forming actions, maybe they are acquiring the virtues, maybe they are going through epistemic and personally transformative experiences. But what if it doesn't lead ultimately to them becoming exemplars because their life is cut short, or something happens, or they lose the capacity, maybe the mental ability to become an exemplar? So what happens to these non-exemplary sufferers? Because we still have people who suffered who haven't become exemplars. Now, this is a very important, because if my theodicy is going to work, it needs to work. I want to give a theodicy that's comprehensive. It's not just going to explain a certain limited amount of people, but all people. So non-exemplary sufferers is an important issue. So the idea here is that there are certain individuals that appear incapable of undergoing exemplar transformation. So this could be infants who die before developing moral agency, severely cognitively impaired individuals who never attain capacity for self-formation, those in persistent vegetative states, animals below the cognitive threshold for moral subjecthood. I'll go into animals in a bit. And so the challenge is these beings cannot participate in the four-stage transformative process. They cannot recognize goods through contrast. They cannot engage in self-forming actions. They might not be able to acquire virtues or undergo transformative experiences as personal agents. So it appears pointless. It appears gratuitous. Their suffering seems to serve no function within the exemplarist framework. And so this encompasses a vast problem, because it seems to encompass the vast amounts of suffering throughout history. Countless infants, individuals with severe disabilities, and cognitively simple animals. So we have three solutions to this problem. The first solution is opportunity for others. So if you remember, in the theodicy, we have two components. We have suffering is permitted by God because it enables a transformation for an individual into an exemplar. So that's what we've looked at already. Just now over these four stages. And then the second one is that it provides others with the opportunity to become exemplars. And so this is the point here. So the suffering of non-exemplary sufferers provides essential occasions for others' transformation into exemplars. It creates the moral occasions. Their suffering creates opportunities that will not otherwise exist for others to develop and display exemplary virtues. So these occasions are necessary for enabling exemplar transformation in those who respond. So, for example, compassion. Responding to those who suffer without ability to help themselves develops deep compassion in caregivers. The complete vulnerability and dependence of non-exemplary sufferers evokes compassion in ways other situations cannot. Care and service. Long-term caregiving for those who cannot reciprocate develops selfless service. It requires sustained commitment without expectation of thanks, recognition, or improvement. Also, patience. Attending to those with severe cognitive impairments who cannot understand and cooperate requires extraordinary patience through repeated frustrations and setbacks. Sacrificial love, choosing to care for those who will never improve, never say thank you, never reciprocate, teaches purely giving love rather than transactional relationships. So there's also this idea of multiple beneficiaries. One non-exemplary sufferer may provide transformative opportunities for many people across different contexts: family, medical professionals, community members, policymakers, future generations learning from current exemplars. So that's the first solution. So the idea here is that that second component kicks in here. It seems to provide opportunities for others. But then we also have a very interesting one. This is a novel one. I really put this because I don't think that people have put this as an idea, but I think it works and it can really provide a very strong, I would say, component of this theodicy and maybe potential theodicies as well. And it's the idea of divine exemplarity. Okay, so let me just take a step back. So let's say there is, I'll give you the example. So let's say there is a child, and all we need is a theoretical example. So there's a child that's been shipwrecked with their family on an island, and unfortunately their family died. Okay, maybe they were killed by some animals, and the animals didn't see the child. The child was in a different part of the island, and so the child has now lived. Now the child is suffering. Okay, maybe it's hungry, maybe it's also hurt itself, fighting off maybe some animal, small animal, and so the child is going through suffering. That could be mental suffering, that could be physical suffering, emotional suffering. And so the problem is now, well, why are they suffering? Because let's say for some reason, very unfortunately, they're going to die. So they're not going to become an exemplar. And then secondly, they're not going to provide others with the opportunity to become exemplars because people are not going to know about that child. They're just living on an island. And that child also doesn't have their family around them anymore, so they're not going to be able to respond. If their family was there with them and they were going through suffering, or this second thing will kick in because they would say, yeah, opportunity for others. But that child doesn't have that. So this could have happened, and I would say there was probably a scenario in the world where this happened. And that's a key thing. For this theodicy to work, you need to explain all forms of suffering. So if there is that child, then you seem to have a hole here. How do you deal with this problem? So the point is, we need another component for this non-exemplary sufferer of this child. And so this is where the second one kicks in. And this is still within the 2 points of the theodicy, because what I said in the theodicy, again, is that the reason why God allows suffering is for 2 reasons. Either to now enable someone to transform to exemplar or provide others with transformation to exemplars. Now, I didn't say what the others were. Others includes creation, but also God. And this is the interesting thing now. So God, through omnisubjectivity, and I will define that term, experiences all suffering and manifests virtues that require limitation as their object. So this is the concept. So God possesses perfect empathetic co-experience of all suffering from within each conscious being. So he experiences the infant's pain as the infant experiences it. He undergoes the cognitive confusion, or he himself doesn't undergo it, but he feels the cognitive confusion from that person. He feels the animal's distress as that animal's feeling it. So the idea here is of the concept of omnisubjectivity, which was developed or discovered, if it is a true characteristic of God, by Linda Zagzebski, who is very big on exemplarism and where I developed my theodicy from. So she has this idea of omnisubjectivity, and this is the idea that basically, in the most simple sense, God knows what it's like to be you. So he knows what it's like to be any conscious being, any conscious subject. He feels and has their conscious experiences. So God knows what it's like to feel like me talking right now. He knows the feeling that I'm going through. He knows the feeling that I'm going through when I'm playing a sports match, when I'm sleeping, when I'm doing something, when I'm playing an instrument, when I'm doing something, like all my feelings, he knows it. But he also knows my dog's feeling. He knows a cat's feeling. He knows a rabbit's feeling. He knows every conscious subject's feeling. He has empathetic co-experience with them. So this is called omnisubjectivity. And Zebzebski argues that this is a necessary, essential attribute of God because it's part of his cognitive perfection. So it's not just that God will be omniscient, that he'll know of the truth value of every proposition, but he'll also know what it's like to be every conscious agent. That's part of his cognitive perfection. So this now assumes that this is a feature of God. Okay, so just unpacking this a bit more. So God's perfect empathetic participation in all suffering ensures ultimate redemption and manifestation of divine exemplarity. So God's perfect empathetic co-experience of all suffering from within each conscious being, not merely knowing about suffering externally, but experiencing it from the first person perspective of each sufferer. So what Zebzebski says is that omnisubjectivity is a first person perspective. So God knows my first person perspective, or he experiences what I'm going through, my experiences from the first person perspective. And so that also includes every suffering experience of every cognitive agent. God has experienced that with that person from that first person perspective. So it's not I'm just suffering. God is also feeling my suffering with him. He has a distance between me and him in that he knows that this is not his suffering experience and it's mine, but he knows the feeling of that, and he knows what every person's going through with their suffering experience, every cognitive agent. Now, by that being the case, and this is my own original contribution, is that God then is also able to acquire or to manifest the virtues that are intrinsically tied to limitation. So this allows God to manifest virtues such as compassion, courage, solidarity, sacrificial love, which are intrinsically tied to limitation. Virtues that require limitation as their object and would be impossible for God. God cannot be courageous because he never fears anything. Even sacrificial love, because God, I'm not talking about the second person of the Trinity. I'm talking about God the Father here. He didn't become incarnate, so he didn't, in a way, experience what the Son experienced in giving up himself through death. He did experience, obviously, the sacrificing of his Son, but the actual giving up of his life and dying was experienced by the second person of the Trinity. So the idea here is, anyway, so if we're talking about God the Father, who I use the term God for, he has, because of his perfection, he cannot experience the things that we experience because of our limitations. And so that means he doesn't have the virtues that we have, which is strange for us to say, but it is true. There are various virtues that God has, but he also virtues that he cannot have because of his perfection. But because of God's omnisubjectivity, he's actually able to manifest these same virtues by experiencing the same things that we do. So if it is that I run into the burning building and I experience courage from that, God also experiences courage from that action of being able to experience that from my first person perspective. And so what this does then is that this establishes God as the supreme exemplar who grounds morality across all cultures and generations. So this idea here is if God is going to be, because we would say, well, okay, there's many exemplars that exist within reality. Is God an exemplar? We would want to say, yes, God is the exemplar of goodness. He is goodness himself. So that means that God shouldn't be limited in the goodness that he possesses, in the virtues that he possesses. He should possess all of them to be the supreme exemplar. Now you have this through God having omnisubjectivity, because he's able to experience every single thing that I have. He's not limited, but because he co-experiences empathetically with me, he's able to manifest the virtues that I manifest through my limited actions and the suffering that I'm facing. So what this allows God to do is that God himself is able to be transformed into a supreme exemplar through that empathetic co-experience. So he's then the ground of all virtues for every single individual that exists. And that could even be ontologically. Why that person is able to show courage and have courage is because God has empathetically felt it, and so grounds the courage for that individual to then draw from, and the solidarity and the compassion. So the idea here is that God is himself, through the suffering of the individual, is able to have a benefit that's given to him, which is he's also able to manifest and acquire the virtues that he wouldn't have if he didn't have that empathetic co-experience. So God doesn't stand aloof from suffering, but he enters into it. He redeems it through his participation. And so God then, in a way, becomes a supreme exemplar. So there are various virtues you can think of, but there's things like perfect compassion. There's courage that God has, is solidarity. So God demonstrates supreme compassion by suffering with every being. So not distant sympathy, but intimate co-suffering that is perfect because God experiences all suffering without barrier. God manifests courage by voluntarily entering into suffering rather than remaining in purely blissful experience. God demonstrates perfect solidarity with people. He even demonstrates a sacrificial love. He's voluntarily including creature suffering in his divine life out of love. So in experiencing everything that I'm experiencing, God has those virtues, but he also has the perfect virtues by him deciding also to have this empathetic co-experience with me. So he has a full set of virtues that he acquires and he's able to exemplify. So what we have then is that through subjectivity, God becomes a supreme exemplar who perfectly instantiates all virtues, those including those tied to limitation. So God grounds morality not just through goodness, but through exemplarity. God is the ultimate reference points for compassion, courage, solidarity, and love. God's exemplarity is perfect because God experiences all possible forms of suffering, responding to each with perfect virtue. So every human and animal exemplar participates in and points towards God's suffering, so supreme exemplarity. So the idea here is every human and animal exemplar that goes through suffering, God is going through that suffering with them. And he's then also able to have a supreme exemplary status because of that. So I won't go through all of this yet, but the key point here is that what we have is that it seems to be in the scenario, let's go back to this scenario, that the child actually is allowing another to become an exemplar. So that second condition still plays a role, providing others with the opportunity to become an exemplar or transformative exemplar. And that specific individual will be God. So that every isolated form of suffering is not really isolated. It's actually one in which God as well is experiencing that suffering with that person. And so he's able to show compassion. He's able to show courage through that first person perspective. He's able to show empathy. So all those things that will make God that specific supreme exemplar, he's able to have in all of those scenarios. Now, someone could say, well, couldn't he have it? Why does he have to have it in that child scenario? Can he just have it with, because he's having this first person perspective of every person, he could have it compassion from, seeing me stub my toe or seeing me even hurt or having a cancerous illness. Why does it have to have that child happening as well? Because the key thing here is God is a supreme exemplar for everyone. So that means that he's able to have courage that is attuned to that person, that's attuned to every scenario. So the thing is that God is able to be a supreme exemplar, not just for certain individuals, but for every single person, because he's experienced that suffering with them and thus acquired the virtues that were needed in that specific scenario. So what happens is God then is able to become an exemplar. So those two conditions still are met, and now they're met for every single example of suffering. And we're going to see how that's the case. So I'm going to move on. This is a lot, but I'm actually not going to deliver this one now because I like to move on and I'll speak about it later. But the key thing here is that we have an idea of compensation. So and this will, if people are interested, this will be in the book and also in the other work. But we have this idea here that everyone that is a non-exemplar is also going to have a compensation given to them. So specifically, this is again with the divine omnisubjectivity, because God suffers with us and he experiences things, there are certain connections that are built between us and God. And we might not know of those connections, but there are three types of connections: intimacy, appreciation, and contribution. And so through my suffering, there is a shared experience that God has with me of intimacy. Through my suffering, there's appreciation that I will be able to say, thank you, God, for suffering with me at some point in time. It might be in the afterlife that I'll come to say this. And also there's a there's a connection of contribution, that God is able to significantly contribute to my well-being through suffering with me. It seems to be that when other people suffer with other people, they contribute to the betterment of that person. If my friend decides that they're going to eat a diet because I'm eating a certain diet, that's going to help me. is going to allow me to persevere through that suffering. So the idea here is that there are connections that are built between me and God. And so this draws from the work of Robin Collins. But the idea here is that there's a compensation for every non-exemplary sufferer, that when they get to the afterlife, there will be a deep relationship that they have with God that's even deeper than someone who didn't go through suffering, because of the intimacy, the appreciation they'll show towards God, and the contribution that'll be made known to them that God made towards their betterment of their life. So there'll be a compensation through the connections and the depth of relationship that they have with God. And this is for every non-exemplary sufferer. So even if there's that child that suffers and never becomes an exemplar, even though they provide others with that, they provide God with that opportunity to become an exemplar. There'll also be a deep relationship that they have with God that they will have, which will be special in the afterlife. So that's the key thing here. So there's a compensation. Okay, now what I'm going to just speak about now, and I'm going to sort of summarize, because we've been going on for a long time, and this is a big PowerPoint, and I made it on purpose that I want to also make it available for Ratio Christi if they want to look through it in more depth. So I'm not going to deliver this part here, but I just want to emphasize something about animal suffering, because that's going to be the main one. So something I want to say first is that the Theodicy applies exactly for animals in the same way that it applied for humans. Now, this is interesting, because when it comes to animal suffering, people will be like, okay, I get this sounds great for the humans, but how does this deal with animals? Now, what I'm saying to you is that this same thing works for animals. Those same two conditions are there. God permits animal suffering to enable transformative processes through which animals become exemplars within their species appropriate capacities, or provide opportunities for others, including humans and God and other animals, to undergo transformation, ultimately achieving creative flourishing appropriate to each species. So the primary function for animals, God permits animal suffering because it serves as a logically necessary condition for the transformation of cognitively advanced animals into exemplars within their communities. The secondary function for animals, when animal suffering does not transform the individual animal sufferer, it provides opportunities for other sufferings to develop certain virtues, for humans to develop certain virtues, and God to manifest divine exemplarity through omnisubjectivity. So each of these three things are going to kick in. So either the other animals around that animal is going to develop the virtues needed to be an exemplar. Humans are going to be able to develop it if they're around the animals. And lastly, if the animal's isolated, it's going to allow God to develop these virtues. And the key thing here is that it's species appropriate flourishing. So animals achieve creative flourishing appropriate to their cognitive capacities, participating in making the world good through a concept called wild justice, which I'm going to speak about in a bit. So there's an integration with the human theodicy. So animals serve the same fundamental purpose as human suffering. So animal suffering is the same thing that humans go through. They go through the same suffering for the same reasons, but it's going to be species appropriate type of exemplarity. That's the key thing. And so there's a 4-stage process which kicks in as well, which is the same thing. So I'm not going to go in a great amount of depth through it, but the key thing here is that God has the same plan for animals. God wants animals to have this creative aim being realized for them. So God extends his creative aim to non-human creation, enabling animals to also participate in goodness. Now, this might sound really weird, but I really want people to take the perspective on this. Humans have only been on this planet for a very short period of time. Let's say 250,000 years. Okay, the planet's been here for at least 4 billion years or so. And life has been here for a few billion years. And so what we have is that we've had animal life that insurmountably predates human life. And so if God has this plan to make his world into a good world for his creation, and he wants his creation to participate as co-creators, why would he only want a sliver of that time to actually, for this plan to actually kick in when humans came about? Why wouldn't he allow animals to do it? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's because we anthropomorphize animals and say, oh, well, animals can only be moral if they're like humans. That's not true, and I'm going to show how this is the case. So animals themselves can be moral beings. And because they can be moral beings, they can also be exemplary beings. And so they can ground morality and spread goodness within their species context. And so that's something that God will want, because God's whole idea is he wants goodness being spread. and he doesn't mind if goodness is spread by a human or by a non-human animal. He wants goodness being spread and grounded. So why wouldn't he allow humans to, non-human animals to participate in this? And so what we have is, if this is correct, then this process has been happening from the beginning. From the beginning of cognitively developed animals, we've been able to have this creative goal being reached. So animals are able to participate in actively making the world good through developing and displaying something called wild justice, which I'll define. They're able to ground morality in animal communities. So animal exemplars serve as reference points for proper behavior within their species. They're sharers of goodness. Animals exemplars spread cooperative, empathetic, and fair behaviors through their communities. A world with animal exemplars has greater value than one where animals merely exist biologically without moral development. So the problem of animal suffering is a real one, and so I need to deal with it. And so I need to explain why animals suffer. And as I was saying to you, it's because it allows them to transform or provide others with the opportunity to transform. And if we go with the first one, it's because it's needed for the four-stage process to also apply to animals within their species appropriate context. Now, this is a very important discussion, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we have gone for quite long. But I do want to make sense of this, because a lot of people are going to be like, this just sounds too far-fetched, because that's just not, my dog cannot do these things. He cannot be exemplar. But this is because a lot of people haven't actually read the literature on cognitive ethology, which is very important, which is a study of animal minds, which is very developed over the past 20 years or so. And there's been great amount of evidence and discoveries because of animal capabilities and the moral status of animals. And so I just want to make this made known to people. And so this again will be in the monograph where there'll be a devoted, very heavy chapter on this. But it's just to people to understand that actually this stuff is grounded in scientific literature, that this type of thing is a possibility. So the first thing is about metaphysical personhood. So individuals have argued in the cognitive ethology literature for animals being persons. Animals are not just agents, they're also persons, like humans are persons. And why that's the case is because there are four conditions of personhood which are met for animals. So personhood is established through meeting four metaphysical criteria that many non-human species demonstrably possess. First is consciousness, second is cognition, third is self-awareness, and the fourth is other awareness. And the idea here is that animals, according to empirical evidence, demonstrate the personhood extends beyond these, the limitations of humans, in that they themselves are able to meet this criteria. So, for example, great apes, elephants, dolphins, corvids, some parrots, they meet the criteria for personhood through advanced cognition, self-awareness, and other awareness. So this challenges a traditional assumption that personhood is exclusively human. Animals meet these criteria, possessing the cognitive foundation necessary for moral agency or moral subjecthood. Just further developing this with the cognitive ethology, there are 6 cognitive domains that have been examined in the scientific research that shows that animals have great, robust cognitive capabilities. First is memory and learning. They have complex memory systems, observational learning, cultural transmission of tool use. Problem solving, they have novel solution generation, insight learning, flexible strategy adaptation. Social cognition, there's possibilities of theory of mind, understanding of social hierarchies, tactical deception. Communication, they use symbolic communication, referential signals, meaningful vocalizations. Self-awareness, there's some animals that have shown mirror self-recognition, autobiographical memory, even some have shown metacognition. Emotional complexity, there's rich emotional lives, including empathy, grief, joy, and anticipation. So the idea here is that there's great amount of research that's been done to show that animals, again, have these robust cognitive capabilities. And then moving on to the moral status of animals. There's been great work that's been done to show that animals possess something called moral subjecthood. This is that animals occupy a distinctive moral status between mere moral patients and fully rational moral agents. So animals as beings, just saying what a moral subject is. This is that animals as moral subjects are beings that are motivated by moral considerations such as cooperation, empathy, and fairness. So a moral subject is a being that is motivated by moral considerations, moral emotions. They do things for moral reasons. They show cooperation, they show empathy, they show fairness, and things like that. And so this is distinction from moral agency. So people have argued that while not fully agents and moral agents, in that they do not have the rational capabilities to be held responsible for their actions, they are able to be moral subjects of having moral-like behaviors. And so that is the case then that they can participate in morality. Animals can serve as grounds of morality within their communities through admirable traits and behaviors. And then the last thing for this is that I want to focus on this concept of wild justice. So this is the idea that there are moral-like behaviors in animals that cluster into three primary categories that constitute what ethologists have termed wild justice. So many animals exhibit moral-like behaviors organized into these three primary clusters: cooperation, empathy, and justice. So cooperation is working together for mutual benefit, reciprocal altruism, collective problem solving. Empathy is emotional resonance with other states, consolation behavior, perspective taking. And then justice is inequality aversion, fair play in games, and norm enforcement. So this idea here is that there are animals fall into these three categories when it comes to morality: for cooperative reasons, for empathetic reasons, and for justice reasons or fairness. So there's extensive empirical evidence that supports the existence and significance of wild justice in animal communities. So there's great amount of documentation that shows this to be the case. So what this shows then is that we have the possibility for animals to be moral subjects. And thus they have a moral status. They act for moral reasons like humans do. And also they have the cognitive capabilities to be able to do the things that humans do, such as emulation. So why then can they not be exemplars? There's no good reasons from the capabilities or moral status of animals to say that they cannot be. And so my theodicy is allowed to be applied towards them and extend toward them. However, before I sort of take this to be the case, what I want to say first is what the evidence shows is that there are certain animals that have these capabilities. And so that means not every animal is going to show this capability of empathy or cooperation or justice or fairness. And so the question then is, well, what about the suffering of an animal that doesn't have the capability to be a person, or have the six categories of cognitive ethology, or to be a moral subject? They still suffer, don't they? So then how does it apply to them? They can't be exemplars. Well, what I want to also say is there's a limited scope here to actually what suffering can be applied to. What a lot of people make the mistake is that all pain constitutes suffering, when that is not the case. If you remember, suffering is defined by two conditions. You have to have a sensation and you have to have an occurrent desire for the sensation to end. And so what this means is just because you feel a pain doesn't necessarily mean you're suffering if you do not have the occurrent desire for it to end. So the idea here is that only animals who have the cognitive complexity to be able to have an occurrent desire for something to end are then able to have suffering occur to them. So just because an animal might feel pain, if it doesn't have the cognitive capability to be able to do it, then, to have the current desire to be able to want it to cease, then they are not technically suffering. So then you cannot apply the problem of suffering to them. You can say they feel pain, but pain has a great survival mechanism. And so it's only suffering that we see as a problem, not pain as such, because pain is needed for survival. So the idea here is that there's actually a limited scope to what suffering applies to. Suffering applies to the cognitive advanced animals who can have occurrent desires for their pain or their mental or physical sensation to end, and humans who obviously have that. Now, someone might push back and say, well, what about people who have problems, mental disabilities and issues like that they can't have they can't have these desires for it to end? Well, the key point here is that it's the suffering that the person is going through. The pain that the person is going through. Again, if you're going by the definitional accounts, they need to have an occurrent desire. That means that they need to have a desire for that thing to end at that point for it to be called suffering. So the issue that someone will have, the issue that someone will raise is that then you need to have a different definition of suffering. But if we're going with this working definition, which seems to be necessary, these two conditions, and sufficient, then suffering will only be something which needs to be accounted for those who have the ability to have a mental or physical sensation, and for the current desire for it to end. So there's a limitation. This means then it reduces the amount of animal suffering that requires a theodicy. It only required for those who are cognitively able to have those recurrent desires, and also for humans. So it just limits it. So that means you can't just bring up any animal as an example of suffering. You need to also say, do they have the cognitive ability to be able to suffer and not just feel pain? And then you can then say there needs to be a theodicy. And then, if you do, my exemplarist theodicy will apply, because it does apply to those individuals. So what I want to just argue here then is that the limitation is not to say that this is a reason then to throw away animal suffering, not at all. It's just saying that there's an assumption here that suffering applies to every animal when it necessarily doesn't. So it limits the scope. Something I also want to challenge as well is a brutality assumption. So someone might bring up the issue of evolution. Well, okay, God allowed suffering to occur, and evolution, brought about all this suffering. But actually, a lot of cognitive ethologists do not view evolution in that way. They view evolution actually as a positive thing, in that it fostered moral-like capabilities alongside biological adaptation. So the idea here is that evolution isn't just solely about competition and predation, but actually evolution also fosters cooperation, empathy, and fairness. So there's three clusters of wild justice. And so what we have is an emergence of moral-like behaviors, which suggests that evolutionary process serves moral as well as biological functions. So this aligns with theism, because this moral dimension of evolution aligns more closely with the idea that God will allow want to use the evolutionary process to bring about this moral development, not just a biological development. So again, this is just pushing back on this idea, firstly, that animal suffering is as widespread as everyone says it is, when it's more limited. And then secondly, this idea that evolution seems to be a big problem. Why did God use evolution? Well, actually, evolution for a lot of cognitive ethologists is seen as something that actually was necessary to our moral development. So if God is going to allow animals to also take place, to become exemplars, then he's going to want to use this process to bring about the moral capabilities that animals have when it comes to cooperation and empathy and fairness. So I will just I won't go into this now, but what this plays out is animals have the same thing that's been applicable to them, but again, it's at a species appropriate level. So that animals also are able to participate in the basic goods. Animals live a life, and they seek vitality and persistence, knowledge, play, aesthetic experience. They also have practical reasonableness, obviously within cognitive limitations, but they have to order their lives if they're going to hunt effectively and survive. There's sociability, bonding, and cooperation. And there's also proto-religious awareness incipient in some animals. So this is something which has been studied in animals, and it's something which also is big. It's a big sort of area of research, this idea of proto-religious sort of awareness when it comes to the development of religion in animals. Where did religion come from? Where did our religious awareness come from? And so animals do show this type of proto-religious awareness. So they are, we can say, things that participate in the basic goods, which are species appropriate. But again, you have the same thing. There's a need for a contrast. There is a need for feedback for all these animals to be able to deeply participate in these things. So you just can't have these participation in the basic goods to the full sense if you do not have the contrast and you do not have the feedback. And remember that animals have these abilities to be able to actually see these things. They can recognize, when a good is lacking, when food is lacking, and they have this contrast to then be able to develop their evaluative capabilities to understand beneficial from harmful states. But also as well, it's a feedback. So it alerts them when they need to go and do things. Discomfort motivates them to seek better conditions. And then stage 2. Also, we can say that cognitively sophisticated animals possess capacity for genuine character developing actions. So not all animals possess capacity for full self-formation, but many species, particularly those meeting the personhood criteria, demonstrate ability to shape character through choices involving competing motivations. So that is animals with advanced cognition, self-awareness, other awareness can exercise creativity through authentic self-formation. So advanced animals face genuine choice points, creating opportunities for character development. Advanced animals face situations where competing motivations create this type of choice point. And repeated choices shape their stable behavior dispositions and character traits. So actually, many SFAs occur in the social context that animals are within. And so they, over time, lead to what we call well-settled dispositions that define their character. Um, and so the same thing applies then. If that's the case that they perform SFAs, then there's going to be suffering at all of those levels. There's going to be at the sensory level, there's going to be the emotional level, there's going to be at the proto-moral level. So all of these things, again, are going to play a role here in providing, suffering is going to play a role in providing the needed tension for them to be able to perform these self-forming actions. And then we have the same thing with virtue. So sort of at stage 3, animals embody virtuous dispositions within the 3 moral clusters constituting wild justice. So animals can embody and exemplify virtuous dispositions within their cognitive and social capacities, developing stable character traits that guide behavior and inspire emulation within their communities. So what we have is a lot of individuals have marginalized animals. They say, oh no, animals cannot be virtuous, but actually a lot of research has shown that is just not the case. So John Berger, for example, observed that historically humans regularly observe animals to characterize human virtues, recognizing shared qualities across species. Animals served as natural examples for courage, loyalty, perseverance, and cooperation. But there's a contemporary tendency to view animals as purely mechanical or instinct-driven, which overlooks their genuine moral capacities. But again, this doesn't show in the cognitive ethology literature. Actually, the evidence shows that there's sophisticated social and emotional lives of animals. And so animal virtues manifest in ways appropriate to each species' cognitive capacities, their social structures, their ecological niches, and rather than requiring human-like rationality. So we don't need to say, well, for them to be able to have the virtues, they need to be like humans. No, they have them within their species relative context, and their species limited sort of cognitive capacities in their social structures. They still can do these things and have these virtues, but not just substituting and seeing in our mind, that there must be like humans in order to have virtues. That is not the case. The literature really does evidence that they have species appropriate expression of these virtues. They also have stable dispositions. So like human virtues, animal virtues are stable character traits. They develop them over time through repeated actions and experiences. And so I'm not going to spend time on this, but we can look through, and if anyone wants a PowerPoint, so we have the cooperative cluster of virtues, and there's evidence, examples of animals showing these, various animals where they're able to work together for mutual benefit and collective flourishing. But again, there's suffering that's needed in order for these things to occur, for them to be able to have the cooperation that they need. The empathy cluster as well. So animals are able to resonate with and respond to other emotional states. And again, we have various animals that have been able to do this, various evidence that's shown this. But again, there's suffering that's needed for them to be able to exemplify these various clusters of behavior. And then related to this, we also have the justice cluster. And so this is the idea that animals respond to fairness considerations, and they try actively to sustain moral and social norms. And so the idea here is that animals also play a role in trying to establish fairness within their social structure, and suffering is going to play a role in that action of them being able to establish those structures of justice. So what we have here is just stage 3 does seem to be evidence. And again, there's a lot here. I won't go through it because it will take us a long time to unpack these. But the key thing is that they have clusters of virtues that they are able to exemplify, and they are able to also acquire virtues which enable them to be exemplars. And so what we then have is, again, that's for people to look at later. We then have stage 4. There are transformative experiences as well. So animals are able to have transformative experiences. So cognitive animals undergo profound changes in knowledge and behavioral disposition. So advanced animals undergo experiences that are both epistemically and personally transformative. These experiences fundamentally alter behavior dispositions, social roles and cognitive strategies, and the transformation persists long after the experience itself is ceased. So again, you have intensity, you have novelty, you have attention commanding. You also have a lasting impact. So a lot of animals have gone through transformative experiences are going to have intense experiences that have happened to them, novel ones, attention commanding, and a lasting impact. And again, you just have suffering that's going to play a role there, similar to the human one. It's going to have epistemic transformation. Animals gain otherwise inaccessible knowledge through direct experience of suffering. So animals gain otherwise inaccessible knowledge about threats and dangers in their environment, resource locations and availability, social dynamics and power structures, their own capabilities and limitations. So this knowledge cannot be obtained without experiencing the relevant suffering. And same thing with personal transformation. So suffering produces lasting alterations in behavioral patterns, social roles, and cognitive approaches. And again, this is going to change the way in which they operate. So it's going to modify their cognitive strategies, their problem-solving approaches, and it's also going to develop their animal identity. So I'll leave the examples for those who want to look through the PowerPoint. But the key thing is that they go through the 4 stages again. And the severity objection, which was in the first one about the amount of severity, same thing we have applying. There's a correlation with transformation. The more severity of suffering that they have, the more it's going to increase the level of participation in each of those stages. So again, mild discomfort is insufficient for strong enough contrast to appreciate the goods fully, adequate tension for genuine character formation, deep enough virtue development, and intense enough transformative experiences. So it seems to play a big role in allowing them to be able to develop into the exemplars. And so the same thing will apply as well, and we don't need to spend time on it. So someone could ask about non-exemplary animal sufferers, and it's still going to be the same thing of, well, it's going to be transforming, it's going to allow others to transform into exemplars, and it's going to lead also to divine exemplarity, because God also is experiencing all animal suffering. And so every suffering that animal has, is going to allow God himself to manifest that specific thing for that species. And so he's going to be the ground and supreme exemplar for all virtues, for all species and all cognitive life. And then the same thing, God is going to provide a compensation, because it could be that in the future that God allows these animals, if he gives them an existence in the future after their death, so post-mortem, where they're going to also have a very intimate relationship with God, and the same connections are going to be able to apply. So I'm going to sort of leave it there, but I want just people to see that if they do work through the PowerPoint, there's a lot of stuff that they have left. I didn't plan to deliver this, but I wanted just people to know that if you have a question of how it applies to the logical problem, the theodicy. So what I've done so far is I've shown how generally applies to suffering for human and animal suffering, the Exemplarist Theodicy. But also, if you want to see how can it be applied to actually the theoretical problems that have been raised in the literature, I've got this on the PowerPoint as well. So the logical problem, you can see how J.L. Mackey's one, so sort of stating the problem and then seeing how the Exemplarist Theodicy applies to all of these, stage 1, how it applies, stage 2, and 3. And then also I've got this for the evidential problem that was raised by William Rowe. Same thing here. We have sort of the it's laid out, and then we have the stages, which are going to explain how suffering, according to Rowe and his problems that he raises with the case of Sue and the fawn, how they can be explained by the 4 stages. And so, yeah, what we sort of get to at the end of this is this idea that we have a complete picture. We have a way in which the greater good has been found, I would say, because what we have as our task was that we needed the necessity condition to be reached, and we needed the value condition. And what we have is, well, suffering is necessary for the exemplar transformation to take place. Why that's the case? Because suffering plays a role, as it says here, in the 4-fold logical structure. It provides contrast for the basic goods, the tension needed for self-formation. It also provides the adversity needed for the virtues, and the intensity for the transformative experiences. And so if God is going to bring about the good of individuals becoming exemplars and bring about that type of world, then suffering is going to need to be part of each of the stages of this transformative process. And this is for all life, including human and animal life, which God will want to take place. And then the value condition is also met because there are multiple dimensions of value. So exemplars themselves experience profound fulfillment through embodying moral excellence. Communities benefit from having exemplars as moral guides and sources of inspiration. God's creative aim is fulfilled through creatures participating in making the world good. Moral reality itself is enriched through exemplars serving as reference points for moral concepts. So the idea here is that we seem to have a great amount of value that is had. So we have this supreme creator good. Creative flourishing represents the highest good for creatures. Active participation as grounds of morality rather than merely passive recipients of benefits. And so from the sufferer's perspective, it seems to be that they will not want to be without the exemplarity given the suffering required. The good is valuable from the sufferer's own viewpoint, not merely just because they're going to be able to play a role in making the world good, but they'll also be compensated for their suffering with the relationship that they have with God. So we have a unified framework that can put forward. So if anyone asks why does suffering occur, we have the two reasons for transformation into exemplar, providing others, which includes humans, non-human animals, and God to transform into exemplars. And so what we seem to have is a comprehensive approach that utilizes many things, and we have a successful theodicy. So I'm very grateful for allowing me to share this. It's very deep, a lot, and I wanted to overplan the PowerPoint just so people can see that all the bases will be covered. If anyone's interested in my work on this, I've written, if I'm correct, I think I've written an article. I forget the stuff that I write, but I've written an article which was was published by, I think it was the Journal of Christian Ethics, and so it's called The Problem of Suffering, the Exemplarist Theodicy, where I first introduced this theodicy. But I would say I would recommend someone to read it, but not take that as my own current position, because it's a lot more limited what I argued for there. And then in my first book, Analytic Theism, I then further developed the theodicy. But then I really believe that a monograph is needed. And so I've got a monograph that's coming out where I'm going to go into all of this stuff that we've covered in a lot more depth. I also have in my second part, I go through all of the formulations of the problem of evil, from the logical problem with Mackey, with Schellenberg, with others, and then all the evidential problems. And then I also look at divine hiddenness. So it's a fully comprehensive work, but I hope people enjoy it. And I've enjoyed sharing with you guys. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a long one, but hopefully you were able to see that potentially there is a way to answer this problem of suffering.
For sure, Dr. Sijuwade. I had so many comments, great comments too.
Yeah.
While I was taking notes on the presentation, like,
Yes.
I really appreciate like how you describe, like, you define like this idea of like wild justice beforehand to be species appropriate, because as we know, like, many species exemplify virtues that wouldn't be virtues we as humans would exemplify. So say for example, like cats, or like lions for example, like they'll eat their dead cubs, or like how like an invading like a
Yeah.
lion will like try to take out the cubs of like another
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
fa from another father figure. So like I really appreciate, I have so many things. I'm not gonna go over all of them, but I
Yeah.
guess like in terms of like my questions, I'm just gonna keep it down to
Yeah.
three.
Yes.
Um so like I guess under the view that the there are certain types of sufferings that need to be created in order for God to have this sort of like omnisubjectivity. Um well, first off, let's start off with the more I guess you could say the direct condition for that. So for example, the creation of the universe. So I guess under your view, just out of curiosity, did God have to create um a universe in order for him to have omnisubjectivity?
No, so he would have had that as an essential attribute. So the problem is if you say that um, God had omnisubjectivity as an essential attribute, and that requires a creation, then you have to also hold to creation being essential to God, which I don't want to hold to, because I believe creation is contingent, and also it was created out of nothing, so it wasn't always there. So
Hmm.
omnisubjectivity is a capability that doesn't always need to be exercised, but it's just the capability to be able to um, experience empathetically the cognitive experiences of others from a first point perspective or first person perspective. So, yeah, God had the capability the same way that he didn't need to exercise his omnipotence in creating. He didn't need to exercise his omnisubjectivity, but he had that latent until then he created all cognitive life. And then it sort of kicked in its working.
Okay, yeah, that definitely helps. Like, it's not like an essential attribute. It's just more of like a good he chooses to pursue.
Well,
Um,
no. So yeah. So the omnisubjectivity itself is an essential attribute, but the exercising of it is not.
oh,
So
okay, gotcha.
yeah. So the same thing with his omnipotence is an essential attribute, but his exercising of it is not. He doesn't need to exercise it in creating. Um, so yeah, being omnisubjective is something which God is essentially, but being omnisubjective with a creative reality, that means that he's actually undergoing the current state of being omnisubjective is not something which is essential to him. He just has to have the capability, but he might just never exercised it if he didn't bring about his creation.
Okay, yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense. So if
yeah,
I understand it correctly, it's more so like it's essential, it is an essential attribute, but whether or not, just like for the other omnis, like he doesn't
yeah.
display like all of his power
Yes, yes, yeah,
throughout
yeah,
creation.
yeah, yeah.
Um yeah, yeah, okay, I
Yeah.
get that. And then I guess the next one would be like a sort of like Goldilocks objection. So
Mhm.
earlier we talked about how the greater amounts of suffering would lead to even greater amounts of virtues to be exemplified. So I guess my question would be like, why not even more suffering for even more virtues to be exemplified? Does it go into like some sort of like value theory calculus that we
Yeah.
just haven't developed yet, or
Yeah.
do you appeal to something like a multiverse or um
No, no. So we would have that because the thing is that's interesting is that in order for certain virtues to be exemplified, there has to also be the reducing of certain virtues. So, for example, for me to be courageous, um, there has to be uh, there has to be certain things which are going to be lessened. So, for example, let's say someone is patient. Let's say someone is in a burning room, and they're screaming for their life, but they're showing some patience in that they're not, running into the burning room because they're into the other room because they're going to die. So they're being patient and waiting. So they're exemplifying some form of patience there. But in order for me to exemplify my courage, I'm going to reduce the amount of patience that that person is going to be able to exemplify because I'm going to have to go into that burning room to go and save that person. Um, so the idea here is that um, yes, we should have the intensity of our suffering. It needs to be at a certain level for the greater amount of virtues to be possessed by that person, but also that's going to lead to there's going to be like a balancing act of certain things are going to have to be lessened for or intensity for the intensity of another one to be greater. I don't know if that answers your question, but the key thing that I'm saying here is there isn't a need for a multiverse. The idea here is that God is going to want the great amount of um, depth of possession of exemplarity, but it's also going to be to a level where if you get too much suffering, it might be that that would lead to a negative level of a negative result that there wouldn't be exemplarism coming out of it. If you understand what I mean. So
yeah.
if I was someone who goes through some suffering, okay, maybe I can withstand that. But if my whole life was just unbelievable pain for like 100 years of my life, that might break me. Thus, that I will not then become an exemplar. So I think God, in His, I do affirm something like middle knowledge. I think that God would know that this certain level of exemplarity, sorry, a certain level of intensity will be enough for each individual to go through to either allow them to become exemplars or provide others to become exemplars. So, but I don't think He will ever create a world where there's just Because it could be that he just keeps on saying, let me up the intensity of suffering such that, there'll be more exemplarity, but that wouldn't. I think it'll get to a point where God will know that, okay, there will just be too much negatively valenced experiences that come from this rather than positive ones.
Okay, yeah, that definitely
Yeah.
helps. And
Mhm.
then my last question is, I guess it is related to suffering because it deals with like the atonement.
Yeah.
So like under your Exemplarist Theodicy, you mentioned how like Christ is like the greatest exemplar.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering how that cashes out with like the the terminology of like the New Testament being like an imputation of like righteousness or like wrath and things like that, as opposed to like, oh, this is I mean, don't get me wrong, we are called to like exemplify Christ
Mhm.
and things like that. I'm just curious, like if you have like gone into like different theories of atonement or like affirm like a specific one over the other, or like how that cashes out within like the
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
exemplarist theodicy.
Yes, yeah. So I personally hold to sort of two main ones, but I think they work together. So I do hold to a Christus Victor version of the atonement, thus that Christ's life, death, and resurrection was a victory over sin, death, and specifically the evil powers. So Christus Victor is very big for me. And also, I do believe that there is an exemplarist aspect to that as well. Thus, that evil is defeated by God, by Christ's exemplary life, such that he lived a life of goodness to allow evil to be overcome through others living a good life. So, by me emulating Christ and literally living like Christ throughout my life, evil is defeated in my daily life. And in the life of my community if others are emulating that. So my idea here is that I do believe in sort of the Christus Victor model is very big for me. I'm less on the penal substitution idea. I do believe that there is a substitutionary aspect to it. But I do believe that there is so much more emphasis on again the Irenaean idea of recapitulation. That Christ is restating what the human life should be like. So instead of the Adamic life of sin and evil and inclination towards wrongdoing, Christ, through his life, death, and resurrection, recapitulated what human life was like as the second Adam. So my sort of theory, and I do actually have some written work on this. I do have a paper called the Agapeic Theory of Atonements I wrote a few years ago. I do have a monograph that will be coming out a few years from now on the atonement, just for people who are interested in my stuff. And so, yeah, I do have thought about this, and yeah, I do incline towards recapitulation, Christus Victor, and a sort of, I would say, like Peter Abelard's sort of idea of Christ being an exemplar in a certain way, but that's not just it. I think exemplarism does have a role, but there has to be an ontological change that takes place. And I think Peter Abelard's view doesn't get that. But my view of Christus Victor and recapitulation, and then also exemplarism, sort of brings all those things together. So yeah, I do think exemplarism is a key idea because Christ really taught us what it was to be a human being, a true human, through his life, through his death, and then through his resurrection.
Gotcha. Yeah, that
Yeah.
definitely makes sense.
Mhm.
I guess this last one,
Mhm.
I definitely know how you catch it out. You've stated it already in the PowerPoint, but
Mhm.
maybe it might just be useful to for other people like
Yeah.
who are watching this video, like how do you deal with hell?
Yeah, so again, I keep on pointing people to papers. Sorry, I just write a lot. So I do have a paper on hell. I even forget the name of what I put it. I think it's with the Agathos European Journal of Philosophy of Religion, and I think I call it the problem of hell, the presence union model. So I'm an Eastern Orthodox. I used to be Catholic, but I'm Eastern Orthodox, and that's played a big role in my theological development. So my model of hell is basically it's grounded upon Eastern Orthodoxy, but basically it's called a presence union model. And the idea here is that hell is not a physical location. Hell is the epistemic experience of God's glory. So it's the Orthodox idea that Let's say you have everyone is going to be in the same physical location, but those who lived for Christ, they um, received his atoning sacrifice and they were changed into good individuals. They will respond to God's glory as a positive thing. And those who didn't, they rejected Christ's atoning sacrifice and they were inclined towards wrongdoing. They will experience God's glory as a hellish experience. So the idea here is that heaven and hell is not a space, not spatially located places. There is just one location where people will be presented with the glory of Christ and the glory of the Trinity. And the response to that, the way in which you epistemically access that will be through your response to how the gospel was given to you pre-mortemly. But what I do add to that, so that's the presence idea, that it's the presence of God, which is the experience of heaven or hell, rather than spatial location. But then the union idea is that I also hold to the idea that there will be a certain point in the experience, and it could, I don't know how long temporally there'll be, but there will be there'll be a time where God shows mercy towards those who are experiencing his glory as a hellish experience. Thus, that he would allow them to stop having his experience as a painful thing. He will allow them to he'll show mercy towards them, thus that they will not longer have his experience being a painful thing, but they will still lack the union that those who receive the gospel have with God. So the idea here is that God will show mercy in that he won't allow. What the good thing about this model is that it allows people to move towards a universalist idea without becoming a universalist, because it doesn't say that God is going to allow everyone to now have the heavenly experience. No, everyone will have the experience of God that is determined by their pre-mortem existence. However, the mercy of God through his grace will stop at a certain point the painful or the experience of the senses that the people who are having the hellish experience are undergoing, so that they will have some type of peace, but it will not be if someone's Catholic, the beatific vision, or it won't be if someone's Orthodox, it won't be the experience of theosis. That will only be for those who have received the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what it does is that it shows mercy towards those, but there will still be a lack. And why the good thing about this is that it still gives motivation for those to spread the gospel, because universalism undercuts that. But this says no, because you will have a very hellish experience. God will show mercy towards you, but you will still have a lack in for your rest of eternity, which will not be a good thing for you. So anyways, the article, if anyone's interested, it's a problem. I think I put it as a problem of hell. So I always come up with these snazzy names, but I always forget. I think I called it the problem of hell, the presence union model, and it's published by Agatheos, European Journal for Philosophy of Religion. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, that really is
Mhm.
interesting. This is the first time I've heard about this. So,
Yeah.
like, it's really interesting how you kind of like affirm the eternality of hell in a way, but also not in another way.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, like, I guess like yeah, I mean, it was a really great presentation, super in depth.
Mhm.
So, I guess where
Mhm.
can we find you for future reference, and like what do you
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
nowadays? And
Yeah. So you can find me. A lot of people end up finding me on Facebook. I'm one of those older people that is on Facebook. So yeah, you can find me on Facebook. I'm always happy to accept friend requests and people to message me and ask me questions. So a lot of people normally do that. I upload all of my work on academia. So if you just type in my name on Google and put academia, you'll find all of my published work, all of my papers. And then, yeah, you can find me. I don't have a YouTube channel. I will hopefully get one in the future, so I might make some videos for that. And then, yeah, generally, I mean, a lot of my life is just spent with my family, with work at Birmingham, teaching up there, and church devoted to that. But yeah, outside of that, I write a lot, and I spend a lot of time thinking and writing on philosophy of religion. So for anyone interested in like upcoming stuff, I do always have papers coming out sometimes because I've written a lot. I've sent a lot to journals, and they come out at different points. So I think yeah, there's a few coming out. But book-wise, I've got a book coming out on the Trinity next year. So it's called The Coherence and Truth of the Trinities, published by Palgrave Macmillan. So that'll be coming out. That's my main work on the Trinity. That'll be out in March. I think it's already on Amazon, actually, the pre-order link. And then the Problem of Evil book as well. So I'm on this sort of record of writing a lot of books, but Problem of Evil book should hopefully be out next year. I've signed the contract with Routledge, and the book's already written. I've already written the book. It just needs to go through production. So hopefully next year it'll be out. And then I've got further stuff that will be hopefully in the years to come. But yeah, I'm keeping myself busy. Family, God, family, work and writing. Yeah, that's my main thing.
For sure. That's definitely the grind. Well, we really
Yeah.
appreciate you, Dr. Sijuwade, for
Thank you.
coming on for a talk for Ratio Christi.
Yeah.
But without further ado, we will end the recording. Thank you all for
Yeah.
watching, and this is me signing out. So, peace.
Thank you.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell for more content. Got questions or ideas? Drop them in the comments below. Until then, next time, thanks for watching. This is Your Boy Paul signing out. Peace.